Greetings, brave warriors and shield maidens. If you seek the strength and wisdom of the ancient Vikings, you've come to the right place. Don't waste time. Subscribe to the channel now and join our horde to strengthen this community of true Vikings. As you can see, our channel is new, so your subscription is crucial to our growth. If you're a true fan of the Vikings, show your support. Let the power of the Viking axe guide your hand to click the like button, and in the comments, tell us which city you're watching from so we know where in the world our stories are reaching, all because the icy wind howled through the stone corridors of Ravenholt, the great hall of the north. Astrid, daughter of King Bjorn the Bold, stood before the ornate doors of her father's chambers, her heart pounding beneath her fur-lined cloak. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay beyond. As she pushed open the heavy oak doors, the smell of sickness and impending death assaulted her senses. The once mighty King Bjorn lay wasted on his bed, his long gray hair matted with sweat, his skin sallow and drawn. At his bedside sat Thorstein, the royal advisor, his wizened face creased with concern. "Father," Astrid said softly, approaching the bed. "You summoned me?" King Bjorn's eyes fluttered open, focusing on his daughter with effort. "Astrid," he wheezed, "my only child, come closer." She knelt beside him, taking his frail hand in hers. Bjorn's grip tightened suddenly, surprising her with its strength. "Listen well, daughter," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My time grows short and I must secure the future of our people." Astrid's brow furrowed. "Father, you'll recover. You must—" "Silence," Bjorn commanded, a shadow of his former authority coloring his tone. "The gods have shown me my fate. I go to join them in Valhalla, but first, I must name my heir." Astrid's breath caught in her throat. Surely he couldn't mean, "You, Astrid," Bjorn continued, confirming her unspoken thought. "You shall be queen of the north when I am gone." The world seemed to tilt beneath Astrid's feet. She had never expected this, had never wanted it. As the only child of Bjorn and his shield maiden wife, Astrid had always assumed her father would name a male cousin or trusted advisor as his heir. "But father," she protested, "I'm not prepared for this. The people expect a king, not a woman?" Bjorn interrupted, a wry smile touching his lips. "You are my blood, Astrid. You have the heart of a warrior and the mind of a ruler. The North needs your strength now more than ever." Before Astrid could respond, Thorstein cleared his throat. "Your Majesty," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Perhaps we should discuss other options. The lords of the council—" "The council be damned," Bjorn growled, then dissolved into a fit of coughing. When he recovered, he fixed Thorstein with a steely gaze. "My decision is made. Astrid will rule." Thorstein bowed his head, but Astrid caught the flicker of displeasure in his eyes. She knew then that the battle for her throne had already begun. As if summoned by the tension in the room, the doors burst open, admitting Astrid's cousin, Halfdan. His face was flushed, whether from the cold or from drink, Astrid couldn't tell. "Uncle," Halfdan boomed, striding into the room. "I came as soon as I heard you were ailing. How fare you?" Bjorn's eyes narrowed. "Well enough to name my heir, nephew. Your cousin Astrid will rule when I'm gone." Halfdan's jovial expression froze, then twisted into a sneer. "Astrid? You would leave our people in the hands of a woman?" Astrid rose to her feet, anger flaring in her chest. "Watch your tongue, Halfdan. You speak to your future queen." Halfdan laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Queen. The North needs a strong hand to guide it, not some shield maiden's daughter playing at leadership." "Enough," Bjorn roared, then fell back against his pillows, spent by the effort. "My word is law, Halfdan. Defy it at your peril." A tense silence fell over the room. Halfdan's jaw worked as he struggled to contain his fury. Finally, he offered a stiff bow. "As you command, uncle," he said, his voice dripping with barely concealed contempt. With a final glare at Astrid, he stormed from the chamber. Astrid turned back to her father, her mind reeling. "Father, I—" "Go," Bjorn said softly. Prepare yourself, Astrid. The road ahead will not be easy." With a heavy heart, Astrid left her father's chambers. As she walked the torch-lit corridors of Ravenholt, her mind raced. How could she possibly live up to her father's expectations? How could she lead a people who would doubt her at every turn? Lost in thought, she nearly collided with a cloaked figure rounding a corner. "My apologies," Astrid began, then stopped short as the stranger lowered his hood. His face was weathered by sun and wind, his beard shot through with gray, but it was his eyes that caught Astrid's attention, deep and knowing as if they held secrets of the ages. "No apology needed, Princess," the stranger said, his voice low and gravelly. "Or should I say, Queen Astrid?" Astrid's hand instinctively went to the hilt of her dagger. "How do you know that? Who are you?" The stranger held up his hands in a placating gesture. "I am called Egil, my lady. I bring warnings from the south, and from the threads of fate themselves." "Speak plainly, old man," Astrid demanded. Egil's expression grew grave. "Dark times approach, my queen. An invasion force gathers beyond our borders, hungry for the riches of the north. They bring weapons of terrible power, magics not seen in an age." Astrid's blood ran cold. "How do you know this?" "I have my ways," Egil said cryptically. "But know this. The survival of your people rests on your shoulders. You must be ready." Before Astrid could question him further, Egil melted into the shadows of the corridor, leaving her alone with her turbulent thoughts. That night, as a storm raged outside the walls of Ravenholt, Astrid made her way to a secluded courtyard. There, waiting in the driving rain, stood Ingrid, her mother's former shield maiden and Astrid's secret mentor. "I heard the news," Ingrid said as Astrid approached. "Are you ready for what's to come?" Astrid shook her head. "I don't know, but I have no choice. Will you help me prepare?" Ingrid's weathered face broke into a fierce grin. "Until my last breath, my queen. Now, let's see if you remember your lessons." For hours, as lightning split the sky and thunder shook the stones of Ravenholt, Astrid trained. Sword and axe, spear and shield, Ingrid pushed her to her limits and beyond. When they finally finished, Astrid was soaked to the bone and aching in every muscle, but a fire burned in her heart. As dawn broke, painting the storm-washed sky in hues of pink and gold, a horn sounded from the king's tower. Astrid's heart sank, knowing what it meant. She raced through the halls of Ravenholt, heedless of the startled looks from servants and guards. She burst into her father's chambers, but she was too late. King Bjorn the Bold lay still and silent, his eyes closed in eternal slumber. Thorstein stood at the foot of the bed, his face a mask of sorrow, or was it calculation? "The king is dead," Thorstein intoned. "Long live the queen." Astrid stood frozen, the weight of her new crown already heavy upon her brow. As the first rays of sunlight streamed through the windows, she squared her shoulders and lifted her chin. Whatever challenges lay ahead, from rival claimants, doubtful lords, or invading armies, she would face them. The great hall of Ravenholt echoed with the angry voices of the assembled lords. Astrid, newly crowned Queen of the North, sat upon the high seat that had been her father's, her knuckles white as she gripped the armrests. The air was thick with tension, and the acrid smell of too many unwashed bodies crammed into too small a space. "This is madness," roared Jarl Eirik, his face red with fury. "A woman cannot lead us in these dark times." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Astrid's eyes narrowed as she surveyed the gathering. Many faces were hostile, some uncertain, and precious few showed any hint of support. She rose to her feet, silencing the room with a sharp gesture. "I am the blood of Bjorn the Bold," Astrid declared, her voice ringing clear and strong. "I have been chosen by my father and blessed by the gods. Who among you would dare challenge their will?" For a moment, silence reigned. Then a familiar voice cut through the tension like a blade. "I would, dear cousin." The crowd parted, revealing Halfdan. He strode forward, a wolfish grin on his face. "The North needs a strong hand to guide it, a warrior's hand." not some shield maiden's daughter playing at leadership. Astrid's hand instinctively went to the hilt of her sword. Choose your next words carefully, Halfdan. Treason is a dangerous game. Halfdan's grin only widened. Is it treason to speak the truth? To champion the will of the people? He turned to address the gathered lords. My friends, we stand at the precipice of disaster. Our enemies gather at our borders, and we are asked to follow a girl who has never seen battle. A chorus of agreement rose from the assembly. Astrid felt the situation slipping away from her. She needed to act, and quickly. You speak of battle, cousin, she said, her voice cutting through the noise. Tell me, how many raids have you led? How many shields have you splintered in the shield wall? Halfdan's smile faltered. I have... None, Astrid interrupted. You have done none of these things. While you drank and whored your way through the Southlands, I trained. While you curried favor with sycophants, I studied our laws and customs. She stepped down from the high seat, her hand still on her sword. I may not have seen battle yet, Halfdan, but neither have you. The difference is, I'm not afraid to face it. A ripple of surprised murmurs swept through the crowd. Some of the lords nodded approvingly, while others exchanged uncertain glances. Before Halfdan could respond, the doors of the great hall burst open. A scout, mud-splattered and breathless, stumbled in. My queen, he gasped, dropping to one knee. Ships on the horizon. Many ships, flying unknown colors. The hall erupted into chaos once more. Astrid raised her voice above the din. Silence. This is what we have feared. This is why we must stand united. She fixed Halfdan with a steely gaze. Will you stand with your people, cousin? Or will you continue to grasp for a throne you haven't earned? Halfdan's face twisted with barely contained rage, but he offered a stiff bow. I serve the North as always, he said through gritted teeth. As the council dispersed to prepare for the coming threat, Astrid caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd. Bjorn, the grizzled old warrior who led the rival Ulfson clan, watched her with calculating eyes. An idea began to form in Astrid's mind. Later that evening, in the privacy of her chambers, Astrid paced restlessly. Her trusted shield maiden Ingrid watched from the corner. You're sure about this? Ingrid asked, her voice laced with concern. Astrid nodded. We need allies. The Ulfson clan has the warriors we need. A knock at the door interrupted them. Bjorn Ulfson entered, his massive frame filling the doorway. You summoned me, Queen Astrid? He rumbled, a hint of mockery in his tone. Astrid met his gaze unflinchingly. I have a proposal for you, Jarl Bjorn, one that could benefit us both. She laid out her plan, an alliance between their clans, sealed by marriage. Bjorn's youngest son would wed Astrid's cousin, uniting their bloodlines and their forces. Bjorn stroked his beard thoughtfully. And what do I get out of this arrangement? Besides the honor of aligning with the royal bloodline, Astrid countered. How about the silver mines in the eastern hills? They've been contested between our clans for generations. I'm prepared to grant you full rights to them. Bjorn's eyes widened slightly. It was a generous offer, perhaps too generous. And if I refuse? Astrid's expression hardened. Then you face the coming storm alone. Make no mistake, Jarl Bjorn. This invasion threatens all of us. United, we might survive. Divided, we will fall. For a long moment, Bjorn said nothing. Then slowly, he nodded. You drive a hard bargain, girl. Perhaps there's more of your father in you than I thought. He extended his hand. You have your alliance. As they clasped arms to seal the deal, Astrid allowed herself a small smile. It was a start, but her triumph was short-lived. That night, as the moon hung low and full over Ravenholt, Astrid was jolted awake by a hand clamped over her mouth. Don't move, a voice hissed in her ear. The cold kiss of steel pressed against her throat. Astrid's mind raced. The guard outside her door. Where was he? Then she caught the metallic scent of blood and her heart sank. You should have stepped aside, the assassin whispered. In the dim moonlight, Astrid recognized him as one of Halfdan's men. Halfdan sends his regrets, but his words cut off in a gurgle as a blade erupted from his chest. The assassin collapsed, revealing Ingrid standing behind him, her sword dripping red. "My queen," Ingrid said urgently. "We must go. Now." Astrid needed no further prompting. They fled through secret passages, the sounds of fighting echoing through the halls of Ravenholt. Halfdan had made his move, and it seemed he had more support than Astrid had realized. As they emerged from a hidden door at the base of the fortress, Astrid looked back at her home, her birthright, now lost to her. "Where do we go?" she asked, hating the tremor in her voice. Ingrid's face was grim in the moonlight. "To gather allies, my queen. This fight has only just begun." With one last look at Ravenholt, Astrid turned and melted into the night. She was a queen without a throne, a leader without an army. But as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, she made a silent vow. The autumn wind whipped across the heath, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and the promise of a harsh winter to come. Astrid stood atop a low hill, her cloak billowing around her as she surveyed the ragtag band of followers camped in the valley below. 3 months had passed since her flight from Ravenholt, and in that time, she had crisscrossed the countryside, gathering support where she could. "It's not much of an army," Ingrid said, coming to stand beside her. Astrid's lips quirked in a wry smile. "Not yet, but it's a start." They descended the hill together, walking among the camp. Farmers with pitchforks rubbed shoulders with grizzled veterans. Women sharpened knives alongside their husbands. All looked to Astrid with a mixture of hope and desperation in their eyes. As they neared the center of the camp, a commotion broke out. 2 men were arguing, their voices rising in anger. "What's the problem here?" Astrid demanded, stepping between them. One of the men, a burly farmer named Ulfr, spat on the ground. "This fool thinks we should go home. Bend the knee to your traitor cousin." The other man, younger and clearly frightened, shook his head. "I'm just saying, maybe if we surrender, Halfdan will show mercy. We can't hope to defeat him and the invaders." Murmurs of discontent rippled through the gathering crowd. Astrid raised her hand for silence. "What's your name?" she asked the younger man. "Leif, my queen," he mumbled, unable to meet her eyes. Astrid nodded. "Leif, look at me." Reluctantly, he raised his gaze. "I understand your fear. Halfdan has the fortress, the armies. The easy path would be to surrender, to hope for mercy." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But when has the easy path ever been the right one for our people?" She turned, addressing the entire camp now. "We are Northmen. We do not bow to tyrants or cower before invaders. Halfdan may sit in Ravenholt, but he does not hold the heart of our people. That belongs to us, to everyone willing to fight for what's right." A cheer went up from the crowd. Even Leif managed a tentative smile. Astrid felt a surge of pride, but she knew words alone wouldn't be enough. They needed a victory, something to prove she was worthy of their loyalty. That opportunity came sooner than expected. The next day, as they approached the village of Krockness, they found it in an uproar. The market square was packed with people, and at its center stood none other than Halfdan himself, surrounded by his guards. "Kneel before your rightful king," Halfdan was shouting. "Renounce the false queen and swear fealty to me, or face the consequences." Astrid's blood boiled. Without thinking, she urged her horse forward, breaking through the crowd. Ingrid cursed and followed, along with a handful of Astrid's most loyal warriors. "The only false ruler here is you, cousin," Astrid called out, bringing her mount to a halt before Halfdan. The crowd gasped, Halfdan's face contorted with rage and surprise. "Astrid, how dare you show your face here?" Astrid dismounted, her hand resting casually on the hilt of her sword. "This is my land, Halfdan. These are my people. I'll go where I please." Halfdan sneered. "Your land? Your people? You lost any claim to them when you fled Ravenholt like a coward. Is that what you've been telling everyone?" Astrid countered, her voice carrying across the square. "That I fled? Not that you sent assassins in the night? breaking every law of hospitality and kinship? Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Halfdan's face reddened. Lies. The words of a desperate woman clinging to power she doesn't deserve. Then let the gods decide, Astrid said, drawing her sword. Here and now, Halfdan. You and me. The victor takes the crown. No further bloodshed needed. For a moment, Halfdan looked tempted. Then his eyes narrowed. You think I'd fall for such an obvious trap? No, dear cousin, you'll die, but not by my hand. He turned to his guards. Kill her! Chaos erupted in the square. Astrid's warriors rushed to her defense as Halfdan's men charged. The villagers scattered, screaming. Steel rang against steel as the two sides clashed. Astrid found herself facing two of Halfdan's guards at once. She parried a blow from the first, ducking under the second's wild swing. Her counterattack caught the first man in the throat, and he went down gurgling. The second pressed his advantage, forcing Astrid back. Just as her foot slipped on the muddy ground, an axe whistled past her ear, burying itself in her attacker's chest. Astrid turned to see Ingrid grinning fiercely. Thought you could use a hand, my queen, the shield maiden said. Together, they fought their way through the melee. But Halfdan was nowhere to be seen. The coward had slipped away in the confusion. As quickly as it had begun, the skirmish was over. Halfdan's remaining men fled, leaving their dead and wounded behind. The villagers emerged from their hiding places, looking at Astrid with a mixture of awe and fear. An old woman approached, leaning heavily on a gnarled staff. You saved us from that tyrant, she said, her voice quavering. But now what? The real enemy is still out there, and they'll come for us all soon enough. As if in answer to her words, a horn blasted in the distance, 3 long, mournful notes. Astrid's blood ran cold. She knew that signal. Raiders, she breathed. The invasion has begun. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Astrid organized the villagers, setting up makeshift defenses and evacuating those who couldn't fight. As the sun began to set, the first longships appeared on the horizon. They're heading for Fisherman's Cove, Ingrid reported. The village there is defenseless. Astrid made a quick decision. We can't stop them from landing, but we can hit them while they're distracted. Gather our best warriors. We ride now. Under the cover of darkness, Astrid led a small force to the outskirts of Fisherman's Cove. The scene that greeted them was one of horror. Buildings burned, illuminating the night with hellish light. Screams echoed across the water as villagers were dragged from their homes. We're outnumbered, one of Astrid's men whispered. Maybe 3 to 1. Astrid nodded grimly. Then we'd better make every blow count. For the north. With a fierce war cry, they charged down the beach. The raiders, caught by surprise, turned to face this new threat. Astrid's sword sang as she cut through their ranks, Ingrid at her side. But something was wrong. As they pressed deeper into the village, Astrid noticed strange weapons in the hands of some raiders, staffs that crackled with unnatural energy, sending bolts of lightning arcing through the air. Shields that seemed to absorb blows without a scratch. One such bolt struck near Astrid, sending her flying. As she struggled to her feet, dazed, she saw a raider level one of the strange staffs at a group of captured villagers. With a sound like thunder, the weapon discharged. Where the villagers had stood, only ash remained. Horror and fury warred within Astrid. What manner of dark sorcery was this? How could they hope to stand against such power? But as she looked around at her people, battered, bloodied, but still fighting, she knew they had no choice. They would find a way. They had to. With a renewed sense of purpose, Astrid raised her sword high. To me, she shouted. For the north. And as her warriors rallied around her, Astrid silently vowed that she would uncover the secrets of these terrible weapons. For only by understanding their enemy could they hope to defeat them. The dawn broke cold and gray over the rocky northern coast. Astrid stood atop a low cliff, her hair whipping in the salt-laden wind as she surveyed the beach below. The invaders' ships dotted the horizon, their dragon-headed prows cutting through the choppy waves. Ingrid appeared at her side, her weathered face grim. "They'll be here within the hour, my queen." Astrid nodded, her hand tightening on the hilt of her sword. "Then we'd best be ready for them." She turned to face the assembled warriors behind her, a motley crew of farmers, fishermen, and what remained of her father's household guards. "This is where we make our stand," she called out, her voice carrying over the crash of waves. "For our homes, for our families, for the North." A ragged cheer went up from the men and women. Astrid could see the fear in their eyes, but also the determination. They would fight to the last. As the enemy ships drew closer, Astrid made her way down to the beach. She took her place at the center of the shield wall, Ingrid to her right, and young Leif, the once doubting farmer who had become one of her most loyal supporters, to her left. "Remember," Astrid said, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "they may have strange weapons, but we have something they don't. This is our home. We know every rock, every tide pool. Use that to your advantage." The first longship ground against the shingle. With a thunderous roar, the invaders poured onto the beach. Astrid raised her shield just in time to deflect a thrown axe. "Hold the line," she shouted. "Shield to shield, don't let them break through." The clash of steel on steel filled the air, punctuated by screams and war cries. Astrid lost herself in the rhythm of battle. Parry, thrust, block, strike. An invader with a crackling staff charged at her. She ducked under his wild swing and buried her sword in his gut. To her left, Leif let out a pained cry. An enemy blade had found a gap in his armor. Without thinking, Astrid stepped in front of him, her shield taking the blow meant to finish him off. She dispatched the attacker with a quick thrust, then glanced back at Leif. "Can you stand?" she asked. Leif nodded grimly, clutching his side. "I can fight, my queen." But the tide of battle was turning against them. More and more enemy ships were landing, overwhelming Astrid's forces through sheer numbers. And those strange weapons, staffs that shot lightning, shields that seemed impenetrable, were taking a devastating toll. "Astrid!" Ingrid's voice cut through the chaos. "We can't hold them here, we need to fall back." Astrid gritted her teeth, knowing Ingrid was right but hating the thought of retreat. "Sound the horn. 3 short blasts. That's the signal to regroup at the village." As Ingrid turned to relay the order, Astrid saw movement out of the corner of her eye. An invader, larger than the rest, was bearing down on them with one of those crackling staffs. "Ingrid, look out!" Astrid cried, but it was too late. The staff discharged with a sound like thunder. Ingrid was thrown backward, her body smoking. Astrid screamed in rage and grief, charging at the giant invader. Her sword found a weak spot in his armor, and he fell with a gurgling cry. Astrid dropped to her knees beside Ingrid. The old shield maiden's eyes were glassy, her breathing shallow. "Go," Ingrid whispered. "Lead them. Make me proud." With a final rattling breath, Ingrid was gone. Astrid felt as if a part of her had been torn away, but there was no time for mourning. Not here, not now. Forcing herself to her feet, Astrid rallied her remaining forces. They fought a fighting retreat up the beach and into the village, leaving a trail of bodies, both friend and foe, in their wake. As night fell, Astrid gathered her captains in the village's great hall. The mood was grim. They had lost nearly half their number in the day's fighting. "We can't stay here," Astrid said, her voice hoarse from shouting orders. "They'll overrun us by morning." "But where can we go?" Leif asked, wincing as a healer tended to his wound. "If we abandon the coast, we leave our people defenseless." Before Astrid could respond, the doors burst open. 2 of her men dragged in a struggling figure, one of the invaders, his strange armor torn and bloodied. "Found him trying to sneak past our lines," one of the guards grunted. "Thought you might want to question him, my queen." Astrid approached the captive, her eyes hard. "Who are you? Why have you come to our lands?" The man spat blood on the floor. "I am Wulfgar, once of the Danes. Now I serve a greater power." "What power?" Astrid demanded. Wulfgar's laugh was more of a cough. You'll find out soon enough. This? He gestured at the destruction around them. This is just the beginning. Our main force is still to come. Thousands of warriors, armed with weapons that will make your precious north burn. A chill ran down Astrid's spine. If he was telling the truth. You're lying, Leif said, voicing Astrid's desperate hope. Why would you tell us this? Wolfgar's bloodied face twisted into a grin. Because it doesn't matter if you know. You can't stop what's coming. None of you can. Astrid's mind raced. If an army that size was truly on its way, they couldn't hope to defeat it head-on. Not with their current forces. They needed time to gather allies, to find a way to counter those strange weapons. She turned to her captains. We retreat inland, to the old fortress in the mountains. Protests immediately erupted. Abandon the coast? We can't. What about the villages, the people? We swore to defend our homes. Astrid slammed her fist on the table, silencing them. I don't like it any more than you do, but if we stay, we die. And then who will be left to save our people? She met each of their eyes in turn. We retreat, we gather strength, and then we come back and drive these bastards into the sea. That is our only hope. Slowly, reluctantly, her captains nodded their assent. All except one, Bjorn, a grizzled veteran of her father's wars. No, Bjorn growled. I won't run. I'll stay and fight, even if I have to do it alone. Astrid felt a flicker of panic. If Bjorn refused to follow her, others might too. Their fragile army could fracture before they even began their retreat. Bjorn, she said, keeping her voice level. I need you. Our people need you. Your experience, your skill. We can't afford to lose that. Bjorn's weathered face was a mask of stubbornness. My place is here, defending our lands, not hiding in the mountains like cowards. Astrid felt her temper flare. Cowards? Was my father a coward when he made strategic retreats? Were you a coward when you followed his orders? She stepped closer to Bjorn, her voice low and intense. This isn't about bravery or cowardice. It's about survival, about living to fight another day. For a long moment, Bjorn said nothing. Then, with a heavy sigh, he nodded. You're right. Forgive me, my queen. I'll follow where you lead. Astrid clasped his arm, relief flooding through her. Thank you, Bjorn. I promise you, we will return. And when we do, we'll make these invaders regret ever setting foot on our shores. As the others filed out to prepare for the journey, Astrid remained in the hall. She unsheathed her sword, the blade that had been her father's, and held it up to the flickering torchlight. Watch over us, she whispered to her father, to Ingrid, to all those they had lost. Guide us, and give us strength for the battles to come. With a final look at the map of her homeland, Astrid sheathed her sword and strode out into the night. The road ahead would be hard, but she would not falter. For the sake of her people, for the future of the North, she would find a way to triumph. The real war, Astrid knew, was only just beginning. The ancient fortress of Drakagem loomed before them, a crumbling behemoth of stone and shadow clinging to the mountainside. Astrid reined in her horse, surveying the dilapidated walls with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Behind her stretched a ragged line of refugees and warriors, all that remained of her people after their grueling journey through the mountain passes. It's seen better days, Leif muttered, coming up beside her. Astrid managed a wry smile. It has. But these walls have stood for centuries. They'll shelter us yet. As they approached the fortress gates, overgrown with thick vines, Astrid felt a strange sensation, as if the very stones were welcoming her home. She shook off the feeling, attributing it to exhaustion and the tales her father had told her of this place in her youth. Open the gates, she called out, and make haste. Our enemies won't be far behind. The next few days were a flurry of activity as they worked to make Drakagem habitable. Astrid found herself everywhere at once, organizing hunting parties, overseeing repairs to the walls, settling disputes among the refugees. But always, her eyes were drawn to the central keep, a looming structure that seemed to pulse with hidden secrets. On the third night, as a storm raged outside the fortress walls, Astrid finally found time to explore. She made her way through winding corridors, the flickering torchlight casting dancing shadows on walls adorned with faded tapestries and ancient runes. In a secluded chamber deep within the keep, Astrid discovered a weathered stone tablet, half hidden behind a fallen beam. As she brushed away centuries of dust, her breath caught in her throat. The runes etched into the stone told a tale she had never heard, of her ancestress, Sigrid the Dragonheart, who had built this fortress with arts long forgotten. "My queen?" Bjorn's gruff voice startled her from her reverie. "You should see this." He led her to a hidden alcove where a magnificent sword hung on the wall, its blade gleaming despite the years. Runes along its length spelled out a name, Wormslayer. "The sword of Sigrid," Astrid breathed, reaching out to touch it. As her fingers brushed the hilt, a jolt of energy surged through her. Visions flashed before her eyes, of battles long past, of magic woven into stone, of a power that could turn the tide against their enemies. A horn blast shattered the moment. Astrid and Bjorn raced to the walls to find a sea of torches spreading across the valley below. The invaders had found them. "So it begins," Astrid murmured, gripping Wormslayer tightly. The siege that followed tested every ounce of Astrid's leadership. Day after day, the invaders hurled themselves against Drakegem's walls. Their strange weapons scorched stone and flesh alike, but the ancient magic woven into the fortress held barely. Weeks turned to months. Food grew scarce, and tempers frayed. Astrid found herself mediating increasingly bitter disputes among her people. "We should have stayed and fought," one man shouted during a particularly heated council meeting. "Better to die with honor than starve in this tomb." "And what of our children?" a woman countered. "Would you have them slaughtered for your pride?" Astrid slammed Wormslayer's pommel against the stone table, silencing the argument. "Enough. We came here to survive, to find a way to defeat our enemy. I swear to you we will not die in this place." But even as she spoke the words, a new threat emerged. It started with a cough, just one, then another, and another. Soon, a deadly fever swept through the fortress, felling warrior and child alike. Astrid worked tirelessly alongside the healers, but nothing seemed to slow the plague's spread. As she sat by yet another sickbed, wiping the brow of a delirious child, despair threatened to overwhelm her. "My queen," Leif said softly, approaching with a grim expression. "There's something you need to see." He led her to a secluded corner of the fortress where several bodies lay shrouded. With a shaking hand, he pulled back one of the coverings. Astrid gasped. The corpse's skin was mottled with strange glowing patterns, the same energy that powered the invaders' weapons. "It's not a natural sickness," Leif said. "It's their magic somehow turned against us." Astrid's mind raced. If the plague was magical in origin, then perhaps... She strode purposefully to the chamber where she had found Wormslayer. There, amidst the ancient texts and relics, she found what she sought, a scroll detailing a ritual to cleanse corrupted magic. But there was a catch. The ritual required a key component, the heart of a dragon, and dragons, if they had ever truly existed, had long since vanished from the world. Unless... Astrid's gaze fell on Wormslayer, remembering the visions she had seen. With sudden clarity, she understood. The dragon wasn't a literal beast, but the source of the invaders' power. "Gather the council," she ordered Leif. "I know how to end this, but it won't be easy." When she laid out her plan, the response was predictably mixed. "You can't be serious," Bjorn exploded. "Sneak into the enemy camp, steal their source of power, and perform some ancient ritual? It's madness." "Do you have a better idea?" Astrid challenged. "Our people are dying. If we do nothing, there won't be anyone left to save." In the end, they agreed. Not because they believed it would work, but because they had run out of options. That night, as a new moon cast the world in darkness, Astrid prepared to leave. She donned dark leathers, strapped Worm's lair to her back, and turned to address the small group gathered to see her off. "If I'm not back in 3 days, assume the worst," she said, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her gut. "Bjorn, you'll be in command. Do whatever you must to keep our people safe." Leif stepped forward, his face etched with worry. "Let me come with you," he pleaded. Astrid shook her head. "I need you here. If I fail, you may be our people's last hope." With a final nod to her companions, Astrid slipped out a hidden postern gate and into the night. The enemy camp sprawled before her, a maze of tents and magical wards. Somewhere in its heart lay the key to saving her people, and quite possibly, the entire North. As she crept forward, blending with the shadows, Astrid sent up a silent prayer to her ancestors. She would need every ounce of their strength and cunning to survive what lay ahead. For in the dragon's lair, one misstep meant certain death. But if she succeeded, it could mean the salvation of everything she held dear. Astrid's heart pounded in her chest as she crept through the enemy camp, her body low to the ground, moving from shadow to shadow. The air thrummed with an eerie energy, making the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. Worm's lair, strapped to her back, seemed to pulse in response to the strange magic that permeated the area. As she neared the center of the camp, voices drifted from a large tent, its sides glowing with an unnatural light. Astrid pressed herself against a nearby wagon, straining to hear. "The fortress still stands," a gruff voice growled. "How much longer must we wait?" "Patience, Hrogar," another voice replied, smooth as silk, but cold as ice. "The plague we've unleashed will do its work. Soon they'll be too weak to resist." Astrid's blood ran cold. So it was true. The sickness ravaging her people was no accident, but a deliberate attack. "And what of the artifacts?" the silky voice continued. "Have you found them yet?" "No, Lord Stirkar," Hrogar replied, a note of fear in his voice. "The mountain keeps its secrets well." "Find them," Stirkar hissed. "The power of the Old Ones must be ours if we're to reshape this world." Astrid's mind reeled. Artifacts? Old Ones? What were these invaders truly after? A sudden commotion drew her attention. Guards dragged a struggling figure towards a row of crude cages at the edge of the camp. As they passed near her hiding spot, Astrid caught a glimpse of the prisoner's face and nearly gasped aloud. It was Wulfgar, the turncoat who had revealed the invaders' plans to her months ago. But why was he in chains? Once the guards had left, Astrid crept towards the cages. Wulfgar sat slumped against the bars, his once proud frame battered and broken. "Wulfgar," Astrid whispered. His head snapped up, eyes widening in disbelief. "You," he breathed. "The Northern Queen. What are you doing here?" "Trying to save my people," Astrid replied. "What happened to you? I thought you were with them." Wulfgar laughed bitterly. "I was, until I learned the truth of their plans and tried to stop them." He leaned closer, his voice urgent. "Listen to me. They're not here just to conquer. They seek something far worse, the power to unmake the world itself." Astrid's blood ran cold. "How?" "Ancient artifacts hidden in your mountains," Wulfgar explained. "Relics of a time when gods walked the earth. If Stirkar gets his hands on them, then we need to stop him," Astrid said firmly. "Will you help me?" Wulfgar studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Get me out of here and I'll tell you everything I know." With Wormslair's enchanted blade, Astrid made short work of the lock. As Wulfgar stumbled from the cage, a horn blast split the night air. "Intruder!" a voice shouted. "The prisoner escapes." "Run!" Astrid hissed, pulling Wulfgar along as chaos erupted in the camp. They fled through the maze of tents, dodging grasping hands and wildly flung spells. Just as they reached the edge of the camp, a familiar figure stepped out of the shadows, blocking their path. "Torstein?" Astrid gasped, recognizing her father's old advisor. "What are you doing here?" The old man's face twisted into a sneer. "Ensuring the survival of our people, you foolish girl. something you failed to do. By betraying us to Sturkar? Astrid spat, rage building in her chest. I've made a deal, Torstein replied. In exchange for the artifacts, Sturkar will spare our people. It's the only way. You're wrong, Astrid said, drawing Wormslayer. The blade glowed with an inner fire. There's always another way. Torstein's eyes widened at the sight of the legendary sword. Before he could react, Astrid lunged forward, the flat of the blade striking him across the temple. He crumpled to the ground unconscious. We can't leave him, Wulfgar said. Astrid nodded grimly. Help me carry him. He'll answer for his crimes, but not here. They half-carried, half-dragged Torstein through the forest, the sounds of pursuit growing ever closer. Just as Astrid felt her strength failing, a familiar voice called out, My queen, this way. Leif emerged from the underbrush, leading a small band of warriors. We came as soon as we saw the commotion in the enemy camp, he explained as they hurried towards the secret entrance to Drakegem. Once safely inside the fortress walls, Astrid turned to Wulfgar. Tell me everything you know about these artifacts. What are they? Where can we find them? Wulfgar shook his head. I don't know exactly. But there's a chamber deep in the heart of this fortress. Sturkar believes the key to finding the artifacts lies there. Astrid's mind raced. The hidden chamber she had discovered, with its ancient runes and forgotten lore. Could that be what Sturkar sought? Before she could pursue that thought, a commotion erupted outside. The invaders, enraged by her raid, had launched an all-out assault on the fortress. To the walls, Astrid commanded, pushing aside her exhaustion. We must hold them back. The battle that followed was desperate and bloody. The invaders hurled themselves against Drakegem's ancient stones, their weapons of fell magic scorching the air. Astrid fought like one possessed, Wormslayer cleaving through enemy after enemy, its blade leaving trails of light in the darkness. But even as she fought, Astrid knew it was a losing battle. There were simply too many of them, and her people were weakened by sickness and hunger. Just as dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire, a massive explosion rocked the fortress. A section of the wall crumbled, and invaders poured through the breach. Fall back, Astrid shouted, her voice hoarse. To the keep! As they retreated, Astrid found herself cut off, surrounded by a press of enemy warriors. A spell struck her shoulder, searing pain lancing through her body. She stumbled, Wormslayer nearly slipping from her grasp. This is it, she thought grimly. This is how it ends. But as a killing blow descended towards her, time seemed to slow. The runes on Wormslayer's blade flared to life, and suddenly, Astrid found herself not on the battlefield, but in a vast, echoing chamber. Before her stood a woman of unearthly beauty, clad in armor that shimmered like starlight. With a jolt, Astrid recognized her from the ancient tapestries. Sigrid the Dragonheart, her ancestress. You have proven worthy, daughter of my line, Sigrid's voice echoed in Astrid's mind. The time has come for you to know the truth. Images flashed before Astrid's eyes, of a great battle fought eons ago, of terrible powers sealed away, of a prophecy etched in stone and blood. The artifacts Sturkar seeks are not weapons but keys, Sigrid continued. Keys to a prison built to contain horrors beyond mortal ken. If he succeeds in breaking those seals, then how do I stop him? Astrid asked desperately. Sigrid smiled, a fierce and terrible expression. With the power that runs in your veins, child. The blood of dragons, the magic of the earth itself. She reached out, placing a hand on Astrid's brow. Remember. Knowledge flooded Astrid's mind, ancient words of power, the true nature of Wormslayer, the location of the hidden seals. She gasped, overwhelmed by the influx of information. Go now, Sigrid's voice faded. The fate of the world hangs in the balance. With a jolt, Astrid found herself back on the battlefield, mere seconds having passed. But now, power thrummed through her veins, and certainty filled her heart. She raised Wormslayer high, its blade blazing like a newborn star. To me, she cried, her voice carrying over the din of battle. For the North, for the world. As her warriors rallied around her, Astrid knew that the true battle was only just beginning. But armed with the knowledge of her ancestors and the power of Wormslayer, she would face whatever came next. The mist clung to Astrid like a second skin as she picked her way through the treacherous valley. Wormslayer hummed softly at her hip, its glow the only light in the oppressive gloom. Behind her, Leif and a small band of her most trusted warriors followed, their breath coming in short, nervous gasps. "Are you sure this is the right way, my queen?" Leif whispered, his voice tight with anxiety. Astrid nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at her gut. The vision was clear. The first seal lies at the heart of the Serpent's Valley. As if in response to her words, a cold wind whipped through the rocks, carrying with it the whisper of forgotten voices. Astrid shivered, remembering Sigrid's warning. The ghosts of the past guard the way. Only one who has made peace with their demons may pass. They rounded a bend in the narrow path, and suddenly the mist parted, revealing a sight that made Astrid's blood run cold. Before them stood the gates of Ravenholt, her childhood home, just as it had looked on the night of Halfdan's betrayal. "Impossible," Leif breathed. But Astrid knew better. This was no mere illusion, but a test, one she had to face alone. "Wait here," she commanded, striding towards the phantom fortress. As she approached, figures emerged from the mist, familiar faces twisted with accusation and despair. Her father, King Bjorn, his eyes filled with disappointment. "You failed us, daughter," he intoned. "You let our people fall." Astrid's step faltered, but she pressed on. "I did what I thought was right," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'm still fighting for our people." Next came Halfdan, sneering as he had on that fateful night. "You're weak, cousin, unfit to rule. Give up now and spare what's left of the North." Astrid's hand tightened on Wormslayer's hilt, but she did not draw it. "Your words have no power over me anymore, Halfdan. I know who I am." Finally, as she reached the gates, a figure stepped out that nearly broke her resolve. Ingrid, her mentor and friend, dead on the beaches of their homeland. "Why did you let me die, Astrid?" Ingrid asked, her voice filled with sorrow. "Why couldn't you save me?" Tears stung Astrid's eyes, but she met Ingrid's gaze steadily. "I carry your memory with me always, Ingrid. Your sacrifice wasn't in vain, I swear it." As she spoke the words, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The phantoms faded, and the gates of Ravenholt swung open with a groan. Beyond lay not the familiar halls of her youth, but a small circular chamber. At its center stood an ancient stone, carved with runes that glowed with an inner fire. Astrid approached, Wormslayer drawn. As she neared the stone, words of power rose unbidden to her lips, the knowledge Sigrid had imparted to her. The runes flared brightly, then faded, leaving the stone cracked and inert. The first seal was broken. As Astrid turned to leave, the chamber began to crumble around her. She raced for the exit, the roar of collapsing stone filling her ears. She burst out into the misty valley just as the last of the illusion faded away. Leif rushed to her side. "My queen, are you all right? What happened in there?" Astrid opened her mouth to respond, but a horn blast cut her off. Enemy scouts drawn by the commotion had found them. "To arms!" Astrid cried, Wormslayer blazing to life in her hands. The skirmish was brief but fierce. As Astrid parried a blow from an enemy wielding one of their strange, crackling weapons, she noticed something odd. Wormslayer's blade seemed to absorb the weapon's energy, leaving it momentarily powerless. "The sword!" she shouted to her warriors. "It disrupts their magic. Aim for their weapons." With this new knowledge, they made short work of the scouts. As the last enemy fell, Astrid turned to her band, a grim smile on her face. "We've found their weakness," she said, "and broken the first seal. There's hope yet." But her triumph was short-lived. As they crested a ridge on their way back to Drakegem, Astrid's heart sank. In the distance, great plumes of smoke rose from the direction of the fortress. "No," she breathed, urging her horse to a gallop. They arrived to find Drakegem in ruins, its mighty walls breached in a dozen places, fires still smoldering in the rubble. Scattered groups of survivors huddled in the shadow of the keep, their faces gaunt with hunger and despair. Bjorn, the old warrior, limped towards them, his armor dented and bloodied. "My queen," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "We held as long as we could, but their numbers were too great. Many fled into the mountains." Astrid dismounted, her mind racing. All their plans, all their hopes, reduced to ashes. But as she looked at the faces of her people, battered but unbroken, she felt a fire kindle in her chest. "This isn't the end," she declared, her voice ringing out over the ruins. "We've discovered the enemy's weakness, and I've taken the first step towards unraveling their power." She climbed atop a fallen column, addressing the gathered survivors. "I know you're tired. I know you're afraid. But I swear to you by all the gods and by the blood of our ancestors that this fight is not over." A murmur ran through the crowd. Astrid pressed on, her voice gaining strength. "They think they've broken us, scattered us to the wind. But we are the people of the North. Our strength is not in walls of stone, but in the fire of our hearts." She raised Wormslayer high, its blade catching the light of the setting sun. "Who will stand with me? Who will show these invaders that the North will never kneel?" For a moment, silence reigned. Then slowly at first, but building to a roar, cheers erupted from the survivors. Warriors raised their battered weapons, women clutched improvised arms. Even children stood tall and proud. Leif stepped forward, his face set with determination. "What's the plan, my queen?" Astrid's eyes glinted with a fierce light. "We strike tonight, when they least expect it. Small groups, targeting their weapon caches, will use their own magic against them." As the survivors organized themselves into strike teams, Astrid felt a presence at her side. It was Wulfgar, the former enemy commander, his face grim but resolute. "You've given them hope," he said quietly. "But hope alone won't win this war." Astrid nodded. "I know, but it's a start, and sometimes that's all you need." As night fell, Astrid led her ragtag army down the mountain, melting into the shadows. The enemy camp sprawled before them, its occupants celebrating their apparent victory. They had no idea what was coming. Astrid raised her hand, signaling the attack. As her warriors surged forward, silent as death, she offered a silent prayer to her ancestors. The road ahead was dark and fraught with peril, but for the first time in months, Astrid felt the stirring of true hope in her breast. The night was alive with fire and screams as Astrid led her warriors through the enemy camp. Wormslayer blazed in her hand, its light cutting through the chaos like a beacon of hope. Around her, her people fought with the desperate strength of those who had nothing left to lose. "For the North," Astrid roared, cleaving through an enemy warrior with a single strike. "For our future." Her voice carried over the din of battle, spurring her forces on. They had struck like lightning, catching the invaders unprepared. Now, the air crackled with magic as the enemy scrambled to mount a defense. Leif appeared at her side, his face streaked with blood and soot. "My queen," he panted, "we've secured the western weapon caches, but their main force is rallying near the central tent." Astrid nodded grimly. "Then that's where we strike next. Gather the shield wall." As her warriors formed up around her, Astrid felt a surge of power coursing through her veins. The knowledge Sigrid had imparted thrummed in her mind, ancient words of power on the tip of her tongue. She raised Wormslayer high, its blade glowing brighter than ever before. "Stand fast," she cried. "Let them break upon us like waves upon the shore." The enemy came in a rush, their strange weapons spitting fire and lightning, but where before such an assault would have shattered her lines. Now Astrid stood firm. With a word and a gesture, she called forth a shimmering barrier of energy. The invaders' magic splashed harmlessly against it, their expressions turning from triumph to confusion and fear. "Now!" Astrid shouted. "Push forward!" Her warriors surged ahead, their own weapons newly imbued with the power of the old gods. The clash of steel and sorcery filled the air as the two forces met in a furious melee. In the heart of the battle, Astrid found herself face to face with a towering figure clad in ornate armor. Lord Stirkar, the invaders' fearsome leader, his eyes blazing with an unnatural light. "So," he sneered, his voice carrying even over the din of combat, "the little queen has learned some new tricks. But do you truly think you can stand against me, child?" Astrid met his gaze unflinchingly. "I am Astrid Dragonheart, heir to Sigurd's legacy, and I will see you driven from our lands or dead beneath my blade." Stirkar laughed, a sound like cracking ice. "Bold words. Let us see if you can back them up." He raised his hand, and a bolt of pure darkness lashed out towards Astrid. She brought Wormslayer up just in time, the ancient blade absorbing the brunt of the attack, but the force of it still drove her back a step, her arms trembling with the effort. "Is that all?" Astrid taunted, though her breath came in ragged gasps. "I expected more from the great conqueror." Anger flashed in Stirkar's eyes. He pressed his attack, dark energy swirling around him like a tempest. Astrid met him blow for blow, Wormslayer singing in her hands. Around them the battle raged on, but to Astrid the world had narrowed to just this, her blade, her enemy, and the space between them. As they fought, Astrid felt something stirring deep within her. The power of her bloodline awakened by Sigurd's touch, rising to meet Stirkar's dark magic. With each clash of their weapons, thunder rumbled overhead, as if the very gods were watching their duel. Just as Astrid felt she might finally gain the upper hand, a familiar voice cut through the chaos. "My queen, behind you!" She whirled, barely deflecting a blow aimed at her back. Her eyes widened in shock as she recognized her attacker, Thorstein, her father's old advisor, the one she had thought safely imprisoned. "You!" she gasped, parrying another strike. "How did you—" Thorstein's face was a mask of bitter determination. "I told you, girl. There's only one way to save our people, and if you won't see reason, then you leave me no choice." His betrayal gave Stirkar the opening he needed. A blast of dark energy caught Astrid in the side, sending her sprawling. Wormslayer clattered from her grasp, skidding across the blood-soaked ground. "No!" Leif's anguished cry cut through the air as he fought to reach her side. Astrid struggled to rise, her vision blurring. She could see Stirkar advancing, triumph written across his face. Beyond him, to her horror, she watched as the last of her warriors were driven back. The tide of battle had turned. "It's over, little queen," Stirkar gloated, standing over her. "Your rebellion ends here." But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Astrid felt a familiar warmth at her side. Wormslayer, responding to her need, had somehow returned to her hand. With the last of her strength, she raised the blade. "Not yet," she growled. Light exploded from Wormslayer, momentarily blinding Stirkar. Astrid seized the chance, driving herself to her feet and past the enemy leader. She raced towards the small knot of her remaining warriors, Leif at their center. "Fall back," she shouted. "To the fortress." As they retreated, Astrid risked a glance over her shoulder. What she saw made her blood run cold. Stirkar, recovered from her attack, stood atop a rise. Dark energy swirled around him, coalescing into a monstrous shape, a dragon of shadow and flame. "Run!" Astrid screamed to her people. "Run!" They fled through the night, the roar of Stirkar's abomination echoing behind them. By the time they reached Drakegem, dawn was breaking, but it brought no comfort, for on their heels came the enemy host, their weapons primed for the final assault. Astrid stood atop the battered walls, watching as the invaders arrayed themselves before the fortress. Her people, what was left of them, looked to her with a mixture of hope and fear. "What do we do now, my queen?" Bjorn asked, his gruff voice heavy with exhaustion. Astrid closed her eyes, weighing their options. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped. To stand and fight would mean certain death for everyone. But to run— She opened her eyes, her decision made. Gather everyone, she commanded. We're leaving. Leif stared at her in disbelief. Leaving? But this is our home, our last refuge. No, Astrid said firmly. Our people are our home. These stones can be rebuilt. But if we die here, everything we fought for dies with us. As her warriors spread the word, preparing for a desperate evacuation, Astrid turned her gaze to the mountains behind the fortress. There, in the deepest reaches of the range lay their last hope, the final seal, and perhaps the key to defeating Sturkar once and for all. She placed her hand on Wormslayer's hilt, feeling the power thrumming within it. I'm sorry, she whispered to the ancient stones of Dreckgem, but this isn't the end. I swear it. With a heavy heart, Astrid led her people away from the only home many of them had ever known. Behind them, Sturkar's forces breached the walls, flames rising from the conquered fortress. But as they disappeared into the mist-shrouded peaks, Astrid felt a glimmer of hope. For in retreat, they had found purpose, and in the heart of the mountains, destiny awaited. The dragon's roar may have been silenced for now, but its fire still burned in Astrid's heart, and when it rose again, all the shadows in the world would not be able to stand against it. The mountain winds howled like vengeful spirits as Astrid crouched in the shadows, her eyes fixed on the enemy patrol below. Beside her, Leif tensed, an arrow nocked and ready. They had been playing this deadly game for weeks now, striking from the wilderness, vanishing like mist before the invaders could retaliate. Now, Astrid whispered. Leif's arrow sang through the air, finding its mark in the throat of the lead soldier. Before the others could react, Astrid was among them, Wormslayer flashing in the pale light. It was over in moments, 5 more of Sturkar's men dead in the snow. As they stripped the bodies of anything useful, Leif spoke, his voice heavy with fatigue. How long can we keep this up, my queen? We're winning skirmishes, but losing the war. Astrid sighed, wiping blood from her blade. As long as we must. Every man we kill, every supply wagon we burn, buys our people more time. But in her heart, she knew Leif was right. They were outnumbered, outmatched, and running out of options. That night, as her ragged band huddled around meager fires in a hidden valley, Astrid made her decision. I'm going to the Whispering Caves, she announced. A hush fell over the camp. Bjorn, the old warrior, spoke up, his voice grave. My queen, those caves are cursed. The old ones say fell things dwell there, older than the mountains themselves. Perhaps, Astrid replied, but they also say those caves hold great power, power we desperately need. Despite their protests, Astrid set out alone the next morning. The journey was treacherous, the narrow paths often barely wide enough for a single foothold. As she neared the caves, the very air seemed to thicken, pressing in around her like a living thing. At the entrance, Astrid hesitated. Ancient runes were carved into the stone, their meaning lost to time. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. Darkness enveloped her, so complete she could see nothing, not even her hand before her face. Then, slowly, a pale light began to grow. Astrid found herself in a vast chamber, its walls shimmering with an otherworldly radiance. And there, in the center, stood a figure that made her blood run cold. It was a wolf, larger than any she had ever seen, its fur as white as new-fallen snow. But where its eyes should have been, there were only swirling vortexes of starlight. Who dares enter our domain? The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing in Astrid's mind. Swallowing her fear, Astrid stepped forward. I am Astrid Dragonheart, Queen of the North. I come seeking aid against those who would destroy my people. The wolf thing cocked its head, regarding her with those impossible eyes. And what would you offer in exchange, little queen? For nothing in this world comes without a price. Astrid's hand tightened on Wormslayer's hilt. What is your price? A sacrifice, the creature replied. A piece of yourself, freely given. Your greatest strength or your deepest fear. Choose. Astrid's mind raced, her strength as a warrior, her bond with her people. But then she remembered Sigrid's words echoing across time. The blood of dragons runs in your veins. With sudden clarity, she knew what she had to do. Drawing Wormslayer, Astrid sliced open her palm, letting her blood drip onto the cavern floor. "I offer my blood," she declared. "The power of my line passed down through generations. Use it as you will, if it means saving my people." For a long moment, silence reigned. Then the wolf thing threw back its head and howled, a sound that shook the very foundations of the earth. The chamber filled with blinding light, and Astrid felt power surge through her, unlike anything she had ever known. When her vision cleared, the wolf was gone. But Astrid could feel its presence within her, a wild, untamed force just waiting to be unleashed. She emerged from the caves to find her warriors waiting, drawn by the otherworldly howl. Leif's eyes widened as he took in her appearance. "My queen," he gasped. "Your eyes." Astrid didn't need to see her reflection to know that her eyes now held the same swirling starlight as the wolf's. "Gather everyone," she commanded, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "It's time we took the fight to Sturkar." The next days were a whirlwind of activity as Astrid put her plan into motion. Messengers were sent to every corner of the north, calling all who still resisted to join them. When Sturkar's forces came to crush them, they found not a ragtag band of rebels but an army ready for war. The battle raged across land and sea, Astrid leading the charge. With her new powers, she called down lightning from clear skies, summoned winds to dash enemy ships against the rocks, and fought with the strength of 10 men. Her warriors, inspired by her transformation, fought like demons possessed. As the tide of battle turned, Astrid found herself face to face with a familiar figure, Halfdan, her traitorous cousin, his armor stained with the blood of her people. "So," he sneered, raising his sword, "the little girl playing at queen has learned some new tricks, but do you really think that will be enough?" Astrid met his gaze steadily, Wormslayer humming in her grasp. "I'm not here to think, cousin. I'm here to end this." Their blades met in a shower of sparks, the clash echoing across the battlefield. Halfdan was a skilled warrior, but Astrid was no longer merely human. She moved with inhuman speed and grace, each strike empowered by the wild magic coursing through her veins. As they fought, Astrid could see the fear growing in Halfdan's eyes. "What are you?" he gasped, barely parrying a blow that would have taken his head. "I am what I was always meant to be," Astrid replied, her voice resonating with power. "The true heir of Sigrid Dragonheart and the protector of the North." With a final devastating strike, Astrid disarmed Halfdan, sending his sword spinning away. She placed Wormslayer's tip at his throat, watching him tremble. "Yield," she commanded. For a moment, it seemed Halfdan might comply. Then, with a snarl of hatred, he lunged for a fallen weapon. Astrid's blade flashed once and it was over. As Halfdan's body crumpled to the ground, a hush fell over the battlefield. Astrid turned to face Sturkar's remaining forces, her eyes blazing with starfire. "Your leader is dead," she called out, her voice carrying impossibly far. "Your invasion has failed. Leave our lands now, or share his fate." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, as one, the enemy began to retreat, their will to fight broken by the display of power they had witnessed. As the last of Sturkar's ships disappeared over the horizon, Astrid's people gathered around her, their faces a mix of awe and uncertainty. Leif approached cautiously, dropping to one knee. "My queen," he said, his voice filled with reverence. "What now?" Astrid looked out over the battered but unbroken land of the north, feeling the wild power of the wolf stirring within her. She thought of the ancient seals, of the dangers that still lurked in the shadows, and of the long road ahead to rebuild what had been lost. "Now," she said, her voice carrying the weight of destiny, "we begin anew. The North rises again, stronger than ever before, and woe to any who would threaten our people." As cheers erupted around her, Astrid felt a presence at her side. Not the wolf this time, but Sigrid, her ancestress, smiling with pride. The sky darkened as Astrid stood atop the ancient hill fort, her eyes gleaming with otherworldly light. Around her, the remnants of her army gathered, battered but unbowed. In the distance, Stirkar's forces advanced, their weapons crackling with unnatural energy. "My queen," Leif said, his voice tight with tension. "They outnumber us 3-1. Astrid nodded, her hand resting on Wormslayer's hilt. "Numbers aren't everything, old friend. We have something they don't." "And what's that?" Bjorn growled, the old warrior's face etched with doubt. A feral smile played across Astrid's lips. "The blood of dragons, and the fury of the wolf." As if summoned by her words, a bone-chilling howl echoed across the battlefield. The invaders faltered, their neat formations wavering. Astrid raised Wormslayer high, its blade blazing with blue fire. "Sons and daughters of the North," she cried, her voice carrying impossibly far. "Today we fight not just for our lives, but for our very souls. Will you stand with me?" A roar went up from her warriors, a sound to shake the heavens. Astrid felt the wild power within her surge, responding to their battle fury. She leapt from the hill fort's wall, landing with inhuman grace before her army. "For the North!" she shouted, charging towards the enemy lines. Her warriors followed, their war cries drowning out the invaders' ordered commands. As they closed the distance, Astrid felt the familiar presence of the wolf spirit stirring within her. She embraced it, letting the ancient power flow through her veins. The first rank of enemy soldiers raised their strange weapons, energy building around them. But before they could unleash their assault, Astrid thrust Wormslayer into the earth. A shockwave of pure force erupted from the blade, sending the invaders flying. "Now!" Astrid commanded. "While they're disorganized." Her warriors crashed into the enemy lines like a tidal wave, their own weapons sparking with borrowed magic. Astrid was everywhere at once, Wormslayer singing a song of death and defiance. Where she passed, the invaders fell, their mechanized armor no match for the primal force she wielded. As the battle raged, Astrid caught sight of a familiar figure, Stirkar himself, rallying his troops. Their eyes met across the chaos, and Astrid felt a chill run down her spine. The enemy leader's gaze burned with an unholy light, promising destruction. "Leif!" she called. "Hold the line! I'm going after their leader." Before her loyal captain could protest, Astrid was moving, cutting a path through the enemy ranks. Stirkar saw her coming and raised his staff, dark energy coalescing around him. "So," he sneered as Astrid approached, "the little queen thinks to challenge me directly. Brave but foolish." Astrid leveled Wormslayer at him, its blue flame a stark contrast to Stirkar's shadowy power. "It ends here, invader. You and your kind will plague our lands no more." Stirkar's laughter was like breaking glass. "You have no idea of the forces you're dealing with, child. I am beyond your petty magics and ancient bloodlines." He struck without warning, a bolt of pure darkness lancing towards Astrid. She barely managed to deflect it with Wormslayer, the impact sending her skidding backwards. Stirkar pressed his advantage, each blow threatening to overwhelm her defenses. As they fought, the battle swirled around them, neither army willing to interfere with the duel that would decide their fates. Astrid found herself driven back, Stirkar's power seeming to grow with each passing moment. "You see?" he taunted, batting aside one of her attacks. "You are nothing before me. Yield now, and I may yet spare your people." Astrid felt doubt creeping in, the wolf spirit within her howling in frustration. Was this truly the limit of her power? Had her sacrifice in the Whispering Caves been for nothing? Then, just as despair threatened to overwhelm her, she heard it, a sound that made her heart soar, the thunder of hoofbeats, accompanied by a familiar war cry. For Astrid, for the North. Reinforcements had arrived, led by none other than Sigrid herself, the spirit of Astrid's ancestress manifest in this hour of need. The invaders' lines buckled under the assault, caught between Astrid's warriors and the ghostly host. Seeing his army falter, Stirkar's face contorted with rage, "No," he roared. "I will not be denied." He raised his staff high, dark energy swirling around him like a maelstrom. Astrid knew that if he completed whatever fell ritual he was attempting, all would be lost. In that moment, she understood the choice before her. The wolf spirit's power was hers to command, but at a terrible price. To unleash it fully would mean sacrificing a part of herself, burning away her humanity in exchange for victory. Time seemed to slow as Astrid weighed her options. The faces of her people flashed before her eyes, those she had lost and those who still fought on. She thought of the North, its wild beauty and indomitable spirit. "So be it," she whispered. Astrid plunged Worm's lair into the earth once more, but this time she did not channel its power outward. Instead, she let it flow into her, mingling with the wolf spirit's essence. Pain unlike anything she had ever known racked her body as the transformation took hold. When she raised her head, Astrid's eyes blazed with starfire. Her form seemed to flicker, caught between woman and wolf, magic made flesh. With a roar that shook the very foundations of the earth, she launched herself at Storie. The enemy leader's eyes widened in shock and fear as Astrid closed the distance between them in the blink of an eye. Wormslayer met his staff in a clash of light and shadow, the impact sending shockwaves across the battlefield. "Impossible," Storie gasped, struggling to hold her back. Astrid's voice was a feral growl. "You should have stayed in your own lands, invader. The North does not bow to conquerors." With a final titanic effort, Astrid shattered Sturkar's staff. The backlash of energy sent him sprawling, his powers broken. Before he could recover, Astrid was upon him, Wormslayer at his throat. "Yield," she commanded, her voice resonating with otherworldly power. Sturkar looked up at her, defeat written across his face. "I yield." A great cheer went up from Astrid's warriors as the remaining invaders threw down their weapons. Victory was theirs, but the cost had been high. As the battle fury faded, Astrid felt the wolf spirit's power receding. She stumbled, caught by Leaf before she could fall. "Easy, my queen," he said, concern evident in his voice. "It's over. We've won." Astrid managed a weak smile. "Not yet, old friend. There's still much to be done." In the days that followed, Astrid oversaw the expulsion of the invaders from northern lands. Those who wished to stay and live in peace were allowed to do so, but under strict conditions. Sturkar and his lieutenants were imprisoned, their fate to be decided by a council of clan leaders. Finally, as the first snows of winter began to fall, Astrid stood before her people in the great hall of Drakegem. The fortress had been rebuilt, stronger than ever before. Representatives from every clan in the north had gathered to witness this moment. Bjorn, his gruff voice filled with emotion, spoke the ancient words of coronation. "Who stands before us, claiming the right to rule?" Astrid stepped forward, Wormslayer sheathed at her side. "I, Astrid Dragonheart, daughter of kings and heir to Sigrid's legacy." "And by what right do you claim the throne of the North?" Astrid's voice rang out clear and strong. "By right of blood, by right of conquest, and by the will of our people. I have fought for this land, bled for it, and would die for it if need be." A murmur of approval ran through the gathered crowd. Bjorn nodded, a rare smile crossing his weathered face. "Then kneel, Astrid Dragonheart, and rise again as Queen of the North." As the crown was placed upon her brow, Astrid felt the weight of responsibility settle upon her shoulders. But she also felt hope. Hope for a future where her people could live in peace and prosperity. She turned to face the assembled clans, her eyes gleaming with determination. "The road ahead will not be easy," she declared. "There are still threats to face, wounds to heal, but together there is nothing we cannot overcome. For we are the people of the North, and our spirit is unbreakable." The great hall erupted in cheers, the sound of it echoing off the ancient stones. As Astrid looked out over her people, she caught a glimpse of a familiar figure standing in the shadows, Sigrid, smiling with pride before fading away. The legacy of the Dragonheart line lived on. And under Astrid's rule, the North would face whatever challenges the future might bring, united and strong. The rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil echoed through the small village of Ravenswood. Einar wiped the sweat from his brow, his muscular arms glistening in the forge's warm glow. At 18, he was already showing promise as a blacksmith, his dedication earning him an apprenticeship with Thorold, the village's master smith. "Einar, mind that blade, boy." Thorold's gruff voice cut through the air. "You're letting the edge go soft." Einar snapped to attention, quickly adjusting his grip on the tongs. "Yes, master, sorry, master." As he returned the glowing metal to the fire, Einar's mind wandered. He loved the craft, but lately he'd been feeling restless. There had to be more to smithing than horseshoes and plowshares. The day wore on, and as dusk approached, Thorold set aside his tools. "That's enough for today, lad. Clean up the forge and head home." "Yes, master," Einar replied, already moving to organize the workshop. As he swept the floor, his broom caught on a loose floorboard. Curious, Einar knelt down and pried it up, revealing a small hollow beneath. There, wrapped in oilcloth, lay an ancient scroll. His heart racing, Einar carefully unrolled the delicate parchment. The script was faded but still legible. In the hands of the chosen smith, forged in flame and cooled in myth, a weapon to shape the fate of all, when darkness rises and kingdoms fall. Below the verse was an intricate diagram of a sword unlike any Einar had ever seen. Its blade seemed to shimmer even on the page, runes etched along its length. "Master Thorold," Einar called out, excitement evident in his voice. "Look what I've found." Thorold hurried over, his bushy eyebrows furrowing as he examined the scroll. "Where did you get this, boy?" Einar quickly explained about the loose floorboard. "What do you think it means, master? Could it be real?" Thorold's face darkened. "It's nonsense, Einar. Fairy tales and children's stories. There's no such thing as a magical sword. But the diagram, the prophecy—" "Enough!" Thorold snapped, snatching the scroll away. "I won't have you filling your head with such rubbish. Focus on your craft, on real steel and honest work. That's the path to becoming a true smith." Einar's heart sank. "Yes, master," he said quietly, returning to his cleaning. That night, as Einar lay in his bed, he couldn't shake the image of the sword from his mind. He'd always dreamed of crafting something truly extraordinary, something that would be remembered long after he was gone. But Thorold's words echoed in his ears, dampening his enthusiasm. The next day dawned gray and overcast, matching Einar's mood. He trudged to the forge, resigning himself to another day of mundane work. As he stoked the fire, the shop's door creaked open. "Good morning," came a soft, melodious voice. "I seek the master of this forge." Einar turned to see a tall, slender man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. His cloak seemed to shimmer as if woven from starlight. "Master Thorold is out making deliveries," Einar replied. "I'm his apprentice. Can I help you?" The stranger's gaze seemed to look through Einar, weighing his very soul. "Perhaps," he said cryptically. "Tell me, young smith, do you believe in destiny?" Einar hesitated, Thorold's admonishment still fresh in his mind. I'm not sure, sir. I believe in hard work and skill." The stranger smiled. "A diplomatic answer, but I sense there's more to you than that. Have you ever dreamed of forging something extraordinary?" Einar's eyes widened. "How did you—" Before he could finish, a commotion erupted outside. Screams and the clash of steel filled the air. Einar rushed to the door, the stranger close behind. The village was under attack. Raiders on horseback thundered through the streets, torching buildings and cutting down anyone in their path. Einar grabbed a hammer, his heart pounding. "We have to help," he shouted, but the stranger held him back. "This is not your fight, Einar," the man said, his voice suddenly carrying an otherworldly power. "Your destiny lies elsewhere." "How do you know my name?" Einar demanded, struggling against the man's surprisingly strong grip. "Who are you?" The stranger's form seemed to blur, his cloak billowing in a non-existent wind. "I am Alistair, keeper of ancient knowledge and guide to those chosen by fate. The time has come, Einar. The weapon you discovered must be forged, and you are the one destined to create it." Einar's mind reeled. "The scroll?" But Thorold said, "Your master is a fine smith, but he cannot see beyond the mundane," Alistair interrupted. "The raiders attacking your village are but a harbinger of the darkness to come. Only the weapon you are destined to forge can turn the tide." As if to punctuate his words, an explosion rocked the village square. Einar watched in horror as the town hall collapsed, flames engulfing the structure. "I can't just leave," Einar protested weakly, torn between his duty to his home and the allure of Alistair's words. "If you stay, you will die. And with you, the hope of many realms," Alistair said solemnly. "The choice is yours, but know that every moment we delay puts more lives at risk." Einar closed his eyes, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The screams of his fellow villagers tore at his heart, but deep down he knew Alistair spoke the truth. This was bigger than Ravenswood, bigger than anything he'd ever imagined. "What must I do?" he asked, opening his eyes with newfound determination. Alistair nodded approvingly. "Gather what tools you can carry. Our journey begins now, and the path ahead is fraught with danger. Are you prepared to leave everything you know behind?" Einar took one last look at the village, at the only home he'd ever known. He saw Thorold in the distance rallying the villagers to fight back against the raiders. For a moment their eyes met across the chaos. "I'm sorry, master," Einar whispered. Then, turning to Alistair, he squared his shoulders. "I'm ready." As they slipped away from the burning village, Einar couldn't shake the feeling that he was leaving more than just his home behind. He was stepping into a world of legend and prophecy, of magic and destiny. The weight of it all threatened to overwhelm him, but he pushed forward, one step at a time. The forge of destiny awaited, and Einar, the humble apprentice, was about to be tested in ways he could never have imagined. The true journey was just beginning. The first rays of dawn painted the sky in hues of pink and gold as Einar and Alistair crested the hill overlooking Ravenswood. Einar paused, his heart heavy as he gazed upon the smoldering ruins of his home. The raiders had long since departed, leaving behind a scene of devastation that seared itself into his memory. "We should move on," Alistair said softly, placing a hand on Einar's shoulder. "The path ahead is long and treacherous." Einar nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Where are we going?" "To the Frostspine Mountains," the mage replied, gesturing towards the distant peaks that loomed on the horizon. "There lies an ancient forge, one of the few places with the power to create the weapon of prophecy." As they set off, Einar's mind raced with questions. "Alistair," he ventured, how do you know all this about the prophecy about me?" The mage's eyes twinkled mysteriously. "Knowledge is power, young Einar. I've spent centuries gathering it, watching the threads of fate weave their tapestry. Your coming was foretold long ago." Einar frowned. "But I'm just a simple apprentice. Surely there are more skilled smiths out there." "Skill can be taught," Alistair replied. "But the spark within you, the ability to shape destiny itself, that is rare indeed." They trudged on, the terrain growing steadily more rugged as they approached the mountains. Einar's muscles ached, unused to such prolonged exertion. As the sun began to set, Alistair called for a halt. "We'll make camp here," he announced, indicating a small clearing sheltered by towering pines. As Einar gathered firewood, a flicker of movement caught his eye. He froze, straining his ears. The snap of a twig confirmed his suspicions. They were not alone. "Alistair," he whispered urgently, "I think we're being watched." The mage nodded grimly. "Bandits. They've been trailing us since midday. I had hoped to avoid a confrontation, but it seems that's no longer possible." No sooner had the words left his mouth than 5 rough-looking men emerged from the shadows, weapons drawn. "Well, well," the largest of them sneered, a vicious-looking axe clutched in his meaty fist. "What have we here? A doddering old man and his whelp far from home." Einar's hand instinctively went to the hammer at his belt, but Alistair held up a hand to stay him. "Gentlemen," the mage said calmly, "I assure you, we have nothing of value. Why don't we part ways peacefully and avoid any unpleasantness?" The bandits laughed. "Oh, I think you do have something of value," their leader growled, his eyes fixed on Alistair's shimmering cloak. "That fancy garment of yours ought to fetch a pretty price." Einar's mind raced. They were outnumbered and outarmed. Fighting their way out seemed impossible. Then, an idea struck him. "Wait!" he cried, stepping forward. "Before you do anything rash, you should know who you're dealing with." The bandits paused, puzzled by Einar's sudden boldness. "This man," Einar continued, gesturing dramatically at Alistair, "is no ordinary traveler. He is a powerful sorcerer, capable of turning men to stone with a mere glance." Alistair raised an eyebrow but played along, drawing himself up to his full height and fixing the bandits with an imperious stare. The outlaws shifted uneasily, their confidence wavering. "You're bluffing," their leader said, but there was a tremor in his voice. "Are you willing to risk it?" Einar challenged. "Look at his cloak. Have you ever seen fabric that shimmers like starlight? And those eyes, can you not see the power that burns within them?" The bandits glanced at each other nervously. Sensing their indecision, Einar pressed his advantage. "But fear not, the great sorcerer is merciful. Leave us in peace and he will spare your lives. Attack, and..." He let the threat hang in the air. For a tense moment no one moved. Then with a growl of frustration the bandit leader lowered his axe. "Come on, lads," he muttered. "This ain't worth the trouble." As the outlaws melted back into the forest, Einar let out a shaky breath. Alistair chuckled, clapping him on the back. "Well done, my boy. Quick thinking indeed. You may have a future in diplomacy if this smithing business doesn't work out." Einar managed a weak smile, his heart still pounding. "I can't believe that worked." "The most powerful magic often lies in words and belief," Alistair said sagely. "Remember that lesson well." The next few days passed in a blur of aching muscles and blistered feet as they ascended into the Frostspine Mountains. The air grew thin and bitingly cold, each breath a struggle. Yet Alistair pressed on tirelessly, and Einar, determined not to show weakness, followed. During their brief rests, the mage began to teach Einar the rudiments of magic-infused metalworking. It was unlike anything the young apprentice had ever encountered. "Ordinary steel is rigid, unyielding," Alistair explained, holding up a small ingot. "But when imbued with magical energy, it becomes something more, alive almost, responsive to the will of its creator." Einar watched in awe as Alistair muttered an incantation, causing the metal to glow and bend like warm wax in his hands. "How is that possible?" Einar breathed. "All things in this world are connected by unseen threads of energy," the mage replied. "Magic is simply the art of perceiving and manipulating those threads. As a smith, you already possess an innate understanding of metal. This is merely an extension of that knowledge." Einar practiced whenever they stopped, struggling to replicate Alistair's feats. Sometimes he thought he felt a flicker of something, a warmth in his hands, a whispering in his mind. But it always slipped away, leaving him frustrated and doubting. On the 7th day of their journey, they crested a final ridge and beheld their destination. Nestled in a sheltered valley, partially carved into the mountainside itself, stood an immense structure of stone and metal. Steam billowed from great chimneys, and even from this distance, Einar could feel the heat radiating from its heart. "The Forge of the Ancients," Alistair announced, a note of reverence in his voice. "One of the last bastions of true magical craftsmanship in this world." As they approached, Einar's excitement grew. This was it, the place where he would begin to fulfill his destiny. Yet as they reached the massive iron doors, doubt gnawed at him. What if he wasn't worthy? What if this had all been a terrible mistake? Alistair placed his hand on a rune-covered panel, and the doors swung open with a groan of ancient hinges. They stepped into a cavernous chamber, lit by the orange glow of dozens of forges. Sparks flew as hammers rang against anvils, each strike releasing a burst of magical energy that Einar could almost taste. A tall, broad-shouldered woman with ash-gray hair approached them, her piercing gaze evaluating Einar. "So," she said, her voice like grinding stone, "this is the one you spoke of, Alistair? He looks unremarkable." Einar bristled at the dismissal, but Alistair merely smiled. "Appearances can be deceiving, Magistra Varda. I assure you, Einar has great potential." Varda grunted skeptically. "We shall see." "Boy," she barked, fixing Einar with a stern look. "Your first trial begins now. Show us what you can do." She led them to an empty forge, gesturing at the tools laid out before it. "Create something, anything, but it must bear the touch of magic, or it is worthless here." Einar's mouth went dry. He looked to Alistair, but the mage merely nodded encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, Einar stepped up to the forge. He selected a small piece of iron, heating it in the flames until it glowed cherry red. As he began to hammer, he tried to recall Alistair's lessons, reaching for that elusive sense of magical energy. For hours he worked, pouring all his skill and concentration into the task. Yet no matter how he strained, he couldn't feel the magic. The metal remained stubbornly ordinary beneath his hands. Finally, exhausted and disheartened, Einar presented his creation, a simple but well-crafted knife, to Varda. The magistrate took it, turning it over in her hands with a frown. "Competent workmanship," she conceded, "but there is no magic here. You have failed the trial." Einar's heart sank. He looked to Alistair, expecting disappointment, but the mage's expression remained unreadable. I'm sorry," Einar stammered. "I tried, but I couldn't feel the magic. Maybe you were wrong about me. Maybe I'm not the one you're looking for." Varda snorted. "Perhaps. Or perhaps you simply need to learn that true mastery cannot be achieved in a day. Destiny is not a gift, boy. It's forged through sweat, blood, and failure." As they were led to their quarters for the night, doubt and shame warred within Einar. He had dreamed of this moment of proving himself worthy of the prophecy. Instead, he felt smaller and more inadequate than ever. Yet as he drifted off to sleep, Alistair's words echoed in his mind. The most powerful magic often lies in words and belief. Perhaps, Einar thought as consciousness faded, the true trial was only just beginning. The days following Einar's failed trial blurred together in a haze of frustration and self-doubt. He threw himself into his work at the forge, determined to prove his worth, but each attempt to infuse magic into his creations ended in disappointment. Alistair watched silently, his expression unreadable, while Magistra Varda's disapproving frown deepened with each passing day. On the fifth morning, as Einar prepared for another grueling day at the anvil, Alistair approached him with a glimmer in his eye. "Come with me, lad," the mage said softly. "I think it's time we tried a different approach." Curious despite his dejection, Einar followed Alistair through the winding corridors of the ancient forge. They descended a narrow spiral staircase, the air growing thick with the musty scent of old parchment. "Where are we going?" Einar asked, his voice echoing in the confined space. Alistair's eyes twinkled. "To the true heart of this place, the source of its power and knowledge." They emerged into a vast circular chamber, its walls lined with towering bookshelves that seemed to stretch endlessly upward. Braziers cast a warm, flickering light over countless tomes and scrolls, their spines glittering with gold leaf and strange runes. Einar's jaw dropped. "What is this place?" "The library of the forge," Alistair replied, his voice filled with reverence. Here lies the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 legendary smiths, spanning centuries of magical craftsmanship. Einar's fingers itched to touch the ancient volumes, to unlock their secrets. But why show me this now? Why not before the trial? Alistair's expression grew serious. Because, my boy, true knowledge cannot be given. It must be earned, sought out, wrestled from the jaws of failure and doubt. You needed to understand the limits of your current abilities before you could truly appreciate the vastness of what you have yet to learn. He gestured expansively at the surrounding shelves. Your education begins anew, Einar. Immerse yourself in these tomes. Study the techniques of the masters who came before you. Let their passion reignite your own. For the next several days, Einar barely left the library. He pored over ancient treatises on metallurgy, deciphered cryptic diagrams of magical forging techniques, and lost himself in the memoirs of long-dead master smiths. With each page turned, each revelation uncovered, he felt his enthusiasm for the craft blazing to life once more. On the fourth day of his studies, Einar came across a particularly intriguing passage in a weather-beaten journal. The author, a smith from a bygone age, wrote of achieving a state of perfect harmony with the metal, of feeling its very essence flowing through his veins. Excited by the discovery, Einar sought out Alistair. He found the mage in deep conversation with Magistra Varda and another man he didn't recognize, tall and lean, with a shock of red hair and a neatly trimmed beard. "Ah, Einar," Alistair called out as he approached. "Perfect timing. Allow me to introduce Branimir, a visiting master smith from the Eastern Kingdoms." Branimir's piercing green eyes assessed Einar coolly. "So this is your prodigy, Alistair? He doesn't look like much." Einar bristled at the dismissal, but before he could retort, Magistra Varda spoke up. "Branimir has come to study our techniques and share some of his own. Perhaps a demonstration is in order." Her gaze flicked between Einar and the newcomer, a challenge evident in her tone. Branimir's lips curled into a predatory smile. "An excellent idea. What say you, boy? Care to test your skills against a true master?" Pride and uncertainty warred within Einar. He was acutely aware of how much he still had to learn, but the dismissive attitudes of Branimir and Varda stoked a fire in his belly. "I accept," he said, squaring his shoulders. The news of the impending contest spread quickly through the forge. By the time Einar and Branimir took their places at adjacent workstations, a sizable crowd had gathered to watch. Magistra Varda stepped forward, her voice ringing out over the assembled onlookers. "The challenge is thus. Each smith will forge a blade, imbuing it with as much magical power as they can muster. You have until the sun touches the western peak. Begin." Einar took a deep breath, trying to center himself as he had read about in the ancient texts. He selected his materials carefully. A bar of high-carbon steel for the core, softer iron for the outer layers, and a small nugget of star metal he'd found described in one of the old journals. As he began to work, Einar forced himself to tune out the murmurs of the crowd and the rhythmic clanging from Branimir's station. He focused entirely on the metal before him, recalling the words he'd read just hours before. "Feel the essence of the metal. Let it flow through you as blood through your veins." The heat of the forge washed over him as he hammered and folded the steel, layer upon layer. With each strike, he reached out with his senses, straining to perceive that elusive magical energy Alistair had spoken of. At first, there was nothing. But as the hours wore on and sweat poured down his brow, Einar began to feel something. A subtle vibration, a whisper just at the edge of hearing. The metal seemed to come alive under his hands, responding to his will in ways he'd never experienced before. Einar lost himself in the work, time slipping away unnoticed. He folded and hammered, etched runes of power into the blade's surface, and quenched it in a bath of sacred oils. As he worked, that strange new sense grew stronger. He could feel the different properties of the metals he'd chosen, the strength of the steel, the flexibility of the iron, the otherworldly resonance of the star metal. Finally, As the last rays of sunlight painted the forge in hues of gold and crimson, Einar set down his hammer. He held up the finished blade, marveling at how it seemed to hum with barely contained energy. Branimir, too, had finished his work. The two smiths presented their creations to Magistra Varda for inspection. The Magistra examined each blade carefully, her face betraying nothing. After what felt like an eternity, she spoke. Branimir's blade shows exquisite craftsmanship and a masterful command of traditional magical forging techniques, she declared. A smug smile played at the corners of Branimir's mouth. Varda turned to Einar's creation. This blade, however, she paused, her brow furrowing. There is something unique about it, a resonance I've not felt before. Branimir, what do you make of this? The red-haired smith stepped forward, taking Einar's blade in his hands. As soon as his fingers touched the metal, his eyes widened in surprise. By the gods, he breathed. How did you achieve this harmony of elements? I've never felt anything quite like it. Einar, still slightly dazed from the intensity of his work, struggled to explain. I'm not entirely sure. I just tried to feel the metal, to understand its nature. It was like it was speaking to me. Alistair, who had been watching silently until now, stepped forward with a proud smile. It seems, my friends, that young Einar has discovered his unique gift, the ability to sense and manipulate the fundamental properties of metal on a level few can match. Magistra Varda nodded slowly. Indeed. While Branimir's blade is undoubtedly the work of a master craftsman, there is a raw potential in Einar's creation that cannot be ignored. I declare this contest a draw. Branimir's earlier smugness had vanished, replaced by a look of genuine respect. He clasped Einar's shoulder firmly. Well fought, young smith. It seems I was too hasty in my judgment of you. There is much we could learn from each other, I think. Einar, still reeling from the unexpected turn of events, managed a nod. I would be honored to learn from you, Master Branimir. As the crowd dispersed and the excitement of the contest faded, Einar found himself alone with Alistair. The mage's eyes shone with pride and something else, a hint of relief perhaps. You've taken your first true steps on the path of your destiny, Einar, Alistair said softly. But remember, this is only the beginning. The road ahead will be long and fraught with challenges. Are you prepared to face them? Einar looked down at his hands, still thrumming with the echoes of that newfound connection to the metal. He thought of his village, of the prophecy, of the weapon he was destined to forge. For the first time since leaving home, he felt a surge of true confidence. I am, he said, meeting Alistair's gaze steadily. Whatever comes, I'll face it. For my people, for the realms that depend on us. I won't let them down. Alistair nodded approvingly. Then let us continue your training, my boy. The forge of destiny awaits and there is much yet to be done. As they walked back into the depths of the ancient forge, Einar's mind raced with possibilities. He had found his gift, taken the first steps towards mastering it. But he knew that greater challenges and greater discoveries lay ahead. The true test of his skills and his resolve was yet to come. The pre-dawn air bit at Einar's skin as he, Alistair, and Branimir made their way up the treacherous slopes of Mount Ignis. The dormant volcano loomed before them, its jagged peak shrouded in mist and legend. Remind me again why we couldn't have brought horses, Einar grumbled, his breath coming in short puffs as he scrambled over a particularly large boulder. Branimir chuckled, his red beard frosted with rime. Horses? On these slopes? You'd be scraping their carcasses off the rocks below. Alistair, who seemed to glide over the difficult terrain with preternatural ease, called back to them. Focus, both of you. We're nearing the Ashen Pass. The Ignites will be watching. Einar sobered at the mention of the fire-worshipping tribe that guarded the volcano. During their preparations at the forge, Alistair had spoken of the Ignites' fanatical devotion to their mountain god and their hostility towards outsiders. As they crested a ridge, Einar caught his first clear view of their destination. A massive crater yawned before them, wisps of steam rising from its depths. And there, carved into the very face of the mountain, stood an imposing gate flanked by towering statues of flame. "By the gods," Einar breathed. "Save your awe," Branimir muttered. "We've company." From hidden crevices and behind boulders, figures emerged. Their skin was ashen gray, marked with swirling patterns of red and orange that seemed to glow from within. Each carried a wickedly curved blade that gleamed with an unnatural fire. The largest of them, a broad-shouldered man with eyes like smoldering coals, stepped forward. "Halt, outsiders. You trespass on sacred ground. Speak quickly, or feed the mountain's flames with your flesh." Alistair raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Peace, brothers of the flame. We come seeking audience with your elders. I am Alistair, keeper of ancient knowledge. These are my companions, Einar and Branimir, master smiths of the eastern forges." The Ignite leader's eyes narrowed. "Smiths? You come to steal the mountain's heart, to plunder our gods' gifts for your own gain." "No," Einar interjected, earning a sharp glance from Alistair. But he pressed on, drawing on the diplomatic skills he'd honed in the forge. "We come to learn, to pay homage to your god's power. The metal we seek, it's for a weapon of great importance, a weapon that could save many lives." The leader considered this, his fiery gaze boring into Einar. "Pretty words, boy, but words are wind, and wind cannot sway the mountain." Branimir stepped forward, his hand moving to the hilt of his sword. "Perhaps steel can sway it then." "Wait!" Einar cried, his mind racing. He remembered a passage from one of the ancient tomes he'd studied. Speaking of the Ignite's reverence for feats of metalcraft, "Let us prove our worth. Grant us a trial, a test of our skills. If we fail, our lives are forfeit to your god. If we succeed, allow us passage to the mountain's heart." A tense silence fell over the group. The Ignite leader stroked his flame-red beard, considering. Finally, he nodded. "Very well, outsider. You shall have your trial. Follow us." As they were led through the imposing gate and into a vast cavern lit by rivers of molten rock, Alistair whispered to Einar, "A bold gambit, my boy. Let's hope your skills are up to the challenge." The trial, as it turned out, was as grueling as it was dangerous. Einar and Branimir were tasked with forging a blade, using only the raw materials found within the volcano's outer chambers, all while avoiding the unpredictable bursts of steam and spurts of lava that erupted around them. Hours passed in a haze of heat and exertion. Einar's newfound ability to sense the properties of metal served him well, allowing him to identify the most suitable ores hidden among the volcanic rock. Branimir's mastery of traditional techniques complemented Einar's intuitive approach, and slowly, a blade of exceptional quality began to take shape. As they worked, Einar couldn't help but notice the growing crowd of Ignites watching them. Their expressions had shifted from hostility to curiosity, and then to something approaching admiration. Finally, as the last quenching steam hissed away, Einar held up the finished sword. Its blade rippled with patterns reminiscent of flowing lava, and it hummed with a power born of the volcano's fury. The Ignite leader stepped forward, his eyes wide with wonder. He took the blade, testing its balance and edge. "By the Burning One," he murmured, "this is a weapon worthy of the mountain itself." He turned to his people, raising the sword high. "The outsiders have proven their worth. They shall be granted passage to the heart of Ignis." A cheer went up from the assembled Ignites, and Einar felt a wave of relief wash over him. But their ordeal, he knew, was far from over. The descent into the volcano's depths was harrowing. Narrow tunnels wound ever downward, the air growing thicker with sulfurous fumes that burned Einar's lungs. More than once they were forced to press themselves against the scorching walls as a torrent of lava rushed past. "How much further?" Branimir gasped, his face streaked with soot and sweat. Their Ignite guide, A lithe woman named Ember pointed ahead. The heart chamber lies just beyond. But be warned, the god's breath grows stronger there. Linger too long, and you'll join the souls in the mountain's belly. As they entered the vast cavern at the volcano's core, Einar's breath caught in his throat. Pillars of crystallized magma stretched from floor to ceiling, glittering with veins of metal unlike anything he'd ever seen. At the chamber's center bubbled a lake of molten rock, its surface occasionally breaking as globs of precious ore bobbed to the surface. Celestial steel, Alistair breathed, his eyes wide with wonder. Forged in the hearts of fallen stars and tempered in the earth's own fire. This is what we came for, lads. Gather what you can, but be swift. The mountain's patience grows thin. They set to work immediately, using long-handled tongs to pluck the precious metal from the lava's surface. The heat was nearly unbearable, and with each passing minute the toxic fumes grew thicker. Einar's head swam, his vision blurring at the edges. But he pressed on, driven by the knowledge of what was at stake. With each piece of celestial steel they gathered, they came closer to forging the weapon of prophecy, to averting the darkness that threatened to engulf the world. Suddenly, a deep rumble shook the cavern. Cracks spiderwebbed across the ceiling, and chunks of rock began to rain down around them. "The mountain stirs," Ember cried. "We must leave now." They scrambled for the exit, their precious cargo clutched tightly. But as they reached the tunnel mouth, a massive boulder crashed down, nearly crushing Einar. Branimir shoved him clear at the last moment, but the stone caught the red-haired smith's leg, pinning him to the ground. "Branimir!" Einar shouted, moving to help his friend. "No!" Branimir growled through gritted teeth. "There's no time, take the metal and go. We can't just leave you!" Alistair grabbed Einar's arm. "He's right, lad. We have moments before this whole chamber collapses. The mission must come first." Tears stinging his eyes, Einar met Branimir's gaze one last time. The smith managed a pained smile. "Give 'em hell with that blade of yours, boy. Make it one for the ages." With a final, agonizing glance back, Einar allowed Alistair to pull him into the tunnel. They ran, stumbling and coughing in the thickening smoke, the roar of the collapsing chamber echoing behind them. They burst out onto the mountainside, gasping for clean air. Einar's legs gave out, and he fell to his knees, the satchel of celestial steel clanking beside him. As the reality of what had just happened sank in, a mix of grief and guilt washed over him. Alistair placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry, lad. Branimir was a good man and a fine smith. But his sacrifice ensured that our mission can continue. We cannot let it be in vain." Einar nodded numbly, his gaze fixed on the volcano's peak where a plume of ash now rose into the sky. He thought of Branimir's last words, of the blade they were meant to forge. Slowly he rose to his feet, a new determination hardening in his chest. "You're right," he said, his voice hoarse from smoke and emotion. "We have what we came for. It's time to return to the forge and finish what we started." As they made their way down the treacherous slopes, the weight of the celestial steel seemed to grow heavier with each step. Einar knew that the true test still lay ahead, forging a weapon worthy of prophecy, worthy of the sacrifices made to obtain its components. The journey back to the ancient forge would be long and fraught with its own perils. But Einar was changed by what he'd experienced in the heart of Mount Ignis. He was no longer just an apprentice playing at destiny. He was a smith tempered by fire and loss, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The ancient forge hummed with renewed energy as Einar and Alistair returned, their precious cargo of celestial steel drawing excited whispers from the other smiths. Magistra Varda met them at the great iron doors, her stern face softening slightly at the sight of their haggard appearance. "So you survived Mount Ignis," she said, her eyes lingering on the satchel at Einar's hip. "And you brought back the heart of a star. Well done, both of you." Her gaze swept the area behind them, a question forming on her lips. "Branimir fell," Einar said quietly, the words still tasting of ash and guilt. He saved my life." Varda's expression hardened once more, but Einar caught a flicker of genuine sorrow in her eyes. A great loss. Branimir was one of our finest. We shall honor his memory in flame and steel. She turned to Alistair. The council will want a full report. Come. As the magistra led Alistair away, Einar found himself alone in the cavernous main hall of the forge. The weight of recent events pressed down upon him, threatening to overwhelm. But as his eyes fell upon the nearest anvil, a familiar calm settled over him. Here, among the flames and iron, he knew his purpose. Over the next few days, Einar threw himself into his work with a fervor that surprised even himself. The celestial steel sang beneath his hammer, revealing properties unlike any metal he'd encountered before. It was stubborn, resisting traditional forging techniques, but Einar's newfound ability to sense its essence allowed him to coax it into shape. He crafted intricate components, a blade core that shimmered with otherworldly light, a crossguard etched with runes of power, a pommel that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Each piece was a marvel in its own right, but Einar knew they were merely parts of a greater whole. As he worked, Einar couldn't help but notice a change in Alistair's behavior. The mage, once a constant presence offering guidance and encouragement, now appeared only sporadically. When he did visit the forge, his manner was distracted, his eyes darting about as if searching for unseen threats. On the 5th night since their return, as Einar was finishing up a particularly delicate bit of engraving, he overheard a heated conversation echoing from a nearby corridor. "Running out of time," came Alistair's voice, tense and urgent. "The alignment approaches and the weapon must be ready." "Patience, old friend," replied a voice Einar didn't recognize, cold and somehow wrong. "The boy progresses well. Soon, very soon, we shall have what we need." Einar's curiosity got the better of him. Setting down his tools, he crept towards the source of the voices. "And what of the prophecy?" Alistair pressed. "The darkness that threatens to engulf the world?" A chilling laugh answered him. "Oh, Alistair, always so concerned with the greater good, the prophecy will be fulfilled, I assure you, though perhaps not quite in the way you imagined." Einar peered around the corner, his blood running cold at what he saw. Alistair stood with his back to him, facing a shadowy figure whose features seemed to shift and waver like smoke. "Remember our bargain," the shadow thing hissed. "The weapon for your precious knowledge. All the secrets of the universe laid bare before you." Alistair's shoulders sagged. "And the boy? What of Einar?" The shadow waved a dismissive hand. "A tool, nothing more. Once the weapon is complete, his purpose will be fulfilled. Dispose of him as you see fit." Einar stumbled back, his mind reeling. Betrayal burned hot in his chest, warring with disbelief. Alistair, his mentor, the one who had set him on this path, it had all been a lie? In his shock, Einar knocked over a rack of tongs, the clatter echoing through the forge. The voices in the corridor fell silent. "It seems we have an eavesdropper," the shadow voice purred. "Deal with this, Alistair. Prove your commitment to our cause." Einar turned to run, but Alistair was already there, blocking his path. The mage's kindly face was twisted with conflicting emotions: regret, determination, and something darker. "I'm sorry, my boy," Alistair said softly. "I had hoped to spare you this, to let you complete your task in ignorance." "Ignorance?" Einar spat, anger overcoming his fear. "You lied to me, about everything. The prophecy, the weapon. Was any of it real?" Alistair's eyes hardened. "Real? Oh yes, very real. But the truth is far greater and more terrible than you could possibly understand. The weapon you're forging, it's not meant to save this world, Einar. It's meant to unmake it, to break down the barriers between realms and usher in a new age of power." Einar's hand inched towards his hammer. "I won't let you do this. Whatever you and that thing are planning, I'll stop you." A sad smile crossed Alistair's face. "Brave lad, but you're out of your depth." He raised his hand, dark energy crackling between his fingers. "I truly am sorry about this." Einar dove to the side as a bolt of shadowy lightning struck the spot where he'd been standing. He rolled to his feet, snatching up a nearby sword. An ordinary steel blade, nothing like the components he'd been crafting, but it would have to do. "You don't have to do this," Einar shouted, deflecting another magical assault with the flat of his blade. "Whatever that thing promised you, it's not worth it." Alistair advanced, his once kindly face now a mask of cold determination. "You don't understand. The knowledge I'll gain, I'll be able to reshape reality itself. All the suffering, all the chaos of this imperfect world, I can wipe it all away and start anew." "At what cost?" Einar demanded, backing away. His eyes darted around the forge, seeking an escape route. "How many innocent lives will be destroyed in the process?" For a moment, doubt flickered in Alistair's eyes. But then the shadow thing's voice hissed from the darkness. "Finish this, Alistair! Now!" The mage's resolve hardened once more. He thrust both hands forward, sending a wave of dark energy surging towards Einar. The young smith brought his sword up in a desperate parry, but the magical assault shattered the blade and sent him flying backwards. Einar crashed into a workbench, his vision swimming. Through the haze of pain, he saw Alistair approaching, energy gathering for a final, lethal strike. In that moment, Einar's hand closed around something familiar, the pommel of the weapon he'd been crafting. As Alistair loomed over him, Einar swung the unfinished component with all his might. There was a blinding flash and a sound like reality tearing. Alistair stumbled back, clutching his face and howling in pain. The shadow thing screeched, its form roiling and dissolving. Einar didn't wait to see what would happen next. Ignoring the protests of his battered body, he scooped up the scattered components of the legendary weapon and ran. He burst out of the forge's main doors, past startled guards and bewildered smiths. "Stop him!" Alistair's voice roared from within, tinged with pain and fury. "The boy must not escape!" But Einar was already racing down the mountain path, his lungs burning and his legs threatening to give out at any moment. He couldn't think about the enormity of what had just happened, about the betrayal and the cosmic forces at play. All that mattered was putting as much distance as possible between himself and the ancient forge. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Einar finally allowed himself to slow. He collapsed against a boulder, gasping for breath, the weight of the unfinished weapon components a constant reminder of the burden he now carried. What was he to do now? The prophecy, his destiny, it had all been built on lies. Yet the threat Alistair and his shadowy ally posed was all too real. The weapon had to be completed, but not for the purpose they intended. Einar looked down at his hands, calloused and scarred from years at the forge. He thought of Branimir's sacrifice, of the skills he'd honed, of the unique gift he possessed. Perhaps this had been his true destiny all along. Not to be a pawn in some cosmic game, but to stand against the very forces that sought to unmake the world. With a grunt of effort, Einar pushed himself to his feet. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger. But he was a smith, tempered in the fires of betrayal and hardened by loss. He would find a way to complete the weapon, to turn it against those who would misuse its power. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of blood and fire, as Einar stumbled through a dense forest. 3 days had passed since his flight from the ancient forge, and exhaustion gnawed at his very bones. The weight of the unfinished weapon components seemed to grow heavier with each step, a constant reminder of the burden he carried. As darkness fell, Einar's foot caught on an exposed root, sending him sprawling to the forest floor. He lay there, breath coming in ragged gasps, the cool earth pressed against his fevered brow. Perhaps this was where his journey would end, alone in the wilderness, the victim of his own naivety and misplaced trust. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. "Well, well," came a gruff voice from the shadows. "What have we here? A lost lamb or a wolf in sheep's clothing?" Einar struggled to push himself up, squinting into the gloom. A figure emerged from between the trees. A man, broad-shouldered and heavily muscled, with a shaved head and a face crisscrossed with scars. He wore simple robes of undyed wool, but moved with the fluid grace of a trained warrior. I mean no harm, Einar managed, his throat dry and raw. I'm just a traveler seeking shelter. The stranger's eyes narrowed, taking in Einar's battered appearance and the strange bundle at his side. A traveler, you say? With burns on your hands that speak of a forge, and bruises that tell of recent battle? You'll forgive me if I find that hard to believe, boy. Einar's mind raced. How much could he safely reveal? But before he could formulate a response, his body betrayed him. The world tilted sickeningly, and he felt himself falling once more. The last thing he heard before darkness claimed him was the stranger's voice, tinged with grudging concern. Ah, hells. The abbot's not going to like this. Einar drifted in and out of consciousness, fragments of sensation and conversation filtering through the haze of fever. The cool touch of stone beneath him, hushed voices arguing in a language he didn't recognize, the bitter taste of herbal medicine on his tongue. When he finally awoke fully, Einar found himself in a small, sparsely furnished chamber. Sunlight streamed through a narrow window, illuminating walls of rough-hewn stone. He sat up gingerly, wincing at the protest of his battered body. So, the prodigal smith awakens, came a familiar gruff voice. Einar turned to see the scarred man from the forest lounging in the doorway, arms crossed over his chest. Where am I? Einar asked, his voice hoarse. How long have I been here? You're in the monastery of the Iron Fist, the man replied. As for how long? 3 days. Your fever broke last night. He cocked his head regarding Einar with open curiosity. I am Brother Torvan, and you, young smith, have quite a bit of explaining to do. Over the next hour, Einar told his story, or at least a carefully edited version of it. He spoke of his apprenticeship, of the quest for rare metals, of betrayal at the hands of his mentor. He said nothing of prophecies or world-ending weapons, but he could tell that Torvan sensed there was more to the tale. When he finished, Torvan was silent for a long moment, his scarred face unreadable. Finally, he spoke. A smith without a forge, fleeing dark forces he barely understands. It seems the fates have a twisted sense of humor. He stood, gesturing for Einar to follow. Come, the abbot will want to speak with you. Einar followed Torvan through winding stone corridors, marveling at the monastery's construction. Everywhere he looked, he saw evidence of expert craftsmanship in the perfectly fitted stones, the intricately carved wooden beams, the gleaming metal fixtures. They emerged into a large courtyard where dozens of men and women in simple robes moved through complex martial forms with fluid grace. The air rang with the clash of practice weapons and the rhythmic chants of the monks. At the far end of the courtyard stood an imposing figure, a woman easily as tall as Torvan, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her face was lined with age and experience, but her eyes blazed with an inner fire that spoke of barely contained power. Abbot Mara, Torvan said, bowing his head slightly. Our guest is awake. The abbot's piercing gaze fell upon Einar, seeming to strip away all pretense and lay bare the very core of his being. So I see, she said, her voice low and resonant. Tell me, young smith, what brings you to our doorstep? Einar swallowed hard, knowing instinctively that this was not a woman to be trifled with. He repeated the story he'd told Torvan, but under the abbot's scrutiny, he found himself revealing more than he'd intended, speaking of the celestial steel, of the weapon's true purpose, of the mage's dark allies. When he finished, Abbot Mara was silent for a long moment. Then, to Einar's surprise, she laughed, a rich, full-bodied sound that seemed at odds with her stern demeanor. Oh, my boy, she said, shaking her head. You've stumbled into something far greater than you realize. The weapon you speak of, we know of it. The world breaker, some call it. The key to unmaking reality itself. Her expression sobered. and now you find yourself its reluctant guardian. Einar's mind reeled. You know about the weapon? How? We are more than simple warrior monks, Myra replied. For centuries, the Order of the Iron Fist has stood as a bulwark against forces that would threaten the very fabric of existence. We have long known that a day like this would come. Hope surged in Einar's chest. Then you can help me? You can tell me how to destroy it? Myra's eyes hardened. Destroy it? No, child. The Worldbreaker cannot be unmade. It must be completed. But the mage, the shadow thing, will stop at nothing to claim it, Myra finished. Which is why you must finish forging it first. But to do that, you'll need more than just skill at the anvil. You must be prepared to fight and die, to keep it from falling into the wrong hands. She gestured to the monks training in the courtyard. We can teach you, Einar, not just to swing a sword, but to hone your body and mind into weapons as formidable as any blade. In exchange, we ask only that you share your smithing knowledge with us. Our armory could benefit greatly from your skills. Einar's head spun with the implications. He looked down at his hands, calloused from years of work at the forge. Could they truly learn to wield a sword with the same skill they did a hammer? How long? He asked. How long would this training take? Myra's expression was grim. To truly master our arts? Years. But we don't have years. We can give you the basics, enough to stand a fighting chance. 3 months? Perhaps 4. Einar nodded slowly. And the forge? Will I be able to continue work on the weapon? We have a forge, Torvin interjected. Nothing like what you're used to, I'd wager, but serviceable. You can split your time between training and smithing. For a long moment, Einar weighed his options. The thought of spending months here, learning to fight, when the fate of the world hung in the balance. It seemed like madness, but deep down, he knew the abbot was right. Without the skills to defend himself and the weapon, he stood no chance against Alistair and his dark allies. Very well, he said at last. I accept your offer. And so began Einar's new life at the monastery. His days were a grueling mix of physical training and mental discipline. He learned to wield sword and staff, to move with the silent grace of a panther, to push his body beyond what he'd thought possible. In the evenings, he worked at the monastery's small forge, slowly continuing his work on the components of the Worldbreaker. The celestial steel remained stubborn, resisting his efforts to shape it fully, but Einar could feel himself growing closer to unlocking its secrets. Weeks turned to months, and Einar found himself changing in ways he'd never imagined. His body, already strong from years at the forge, became a finely honed instrument of war. His mind, sharpened by the monk's teachings, grew more focused and disciplined. But even as he progressed, a gnawing worry ate at him. What was happening in the outside world? What dark plans were Alistair and his shadowy allies setting in motion? His fears were confirmed one crisp autumn morning. As he sparred with Torvin in the courtyard, a messenger arrived, breathless and wide-eyed, bearing news that sent a chill through Einar's very soul. Abbot, the messenger cried, word from the lowlands. An army marches, led by a mage of terrible power. They lay waste to all in their path, searching for something, or someone. Einar's blood ran cold. He knew with dreadful certainty that Alistair was coming for him, and for the Worldbreaker. But it was the messenger's next words that truly drove the knife into his heart. They approached the village of Ravenswood. It will be in their path within days. Ravenswood, his home, the place where his journey had begun, what felt like a lifetime ago. Einar saw again the faces of those he'd left behind, his family, his friends, old Master Thorald, all of them unknowing in the path of a force they couldn't hope to understand or resist. Abbot Mara's voice cut through his racing thoughts. Einar, your training is not complete. The weapon is not finished. If you leave now... I know, Einar said, his voice tight with anguish. But those are my people. I can't abandon them. He looked down at his hands, smith's hands, warrior's hands, hands that now held the power to shape metal and take life with equal skill. He thought of the unfinished components of the world breaker, hidden away in his chambers. In that moment, Einar knew he faced a choice that would shape not just his own destiny, but the fate of all he held dear. Stay and complete his training, continue work on a weapon that could save or doom the world, or rush to the aid of his village, knowing he might be throwing away everything he'd worked for. The weight of the decision pressed down upon him, heavier than any hammer he'd ever wielded. With a deep breath, Einar steeled himself to make a choice that would alter the course of his journey forever. The road to Ravenswood stretched before Einar like a wound carved into the earth, each step bringing him closer to a confrontation he both dreaded and yearned for. The weight of the unfinished world-breaker components in his pack was a constant reminder of the destiny he was potentially abandoning. As he crested the final hill overlooking his home village, Einar's heart clenched in his chest. Smoke rose from several buildings, and the clash of steel on steel carried on the wind. He was not too late, but only just. Without hesitation, Einar broke into a run, his body moving with the fluid grace instilled by months of training at the monastery. As he neared the village outskirts, he encountered the first signs of the invading force, a small group of soldiers in dark armor, harassing a family trying to flee. "Hey!" Einar shouted, drawing the sword he'd forged at the monastery. "Why don't you pick on someone who can fight back?" The soldiers turned, sneering at what they perceived as an easy target. Their smirks faded quickly as Einar moved among them like a whirlwind of steel, his blade finding gaps in armor with uncanny precision. In moments, the skirmish was over, leaving Einar standing amidst a group of disarmed and thoroughly shocked invaders. "Go," he told the family, who stared at him with a mixture of awe and fear. "Head for the hills. It's not safe here." As he made his way deeper into the village, Einar encountered pockets of resistance, villagers armed with whatever weapons they could find, fighting desperately against the better-equipped invaders. He joined each skirmish, turning the tide with his unexpected skill and inspiring those around him to fight harder. Near the village square, Einar heard a familiar voice bellowing orders. His heart leapt as he rounded a corner to see old Master Thorald, his massive frame silhouetted against the flames of a burning building, wielding a massive warhammer with surprising agility. "Master Thorald," Einar called out, dispatching another soldier with a quick thrust. The old smith turned, his eyes widening in disbelief. "Einar, by the gods, boy, is that you?" There was no time for a proper reunion. Back-to-back, master and apprentice fought off waves of attackers, their movements complementing each other as if they'd been fighting side by side for years. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" Thorald grunted between swings of his hammer. Einar parried a sword thrust and countered with a vicious pommel strike. "It's a long story, master. One best told over ale when this is all over." As the immediate threat subsided, Einar quickly explained the situation, the betrayal of Alistair, the true nature of the weapon he'd been forging, and the dark forces that now threatened not just Ravenswood but the entire world. Thorald's bushy eyebrows drew together in a fierce scowl. "I always knew that fancy-talking mage was trouble, but this is beyond anything I could have imagined." He placed a hand on Einar's shoulder, his expression softening. "I'm proud of you, lad. You've grown into a fine warrior and an even finer smith. Now tell me how I can help." Einar's mind raced. He hadn't dared hope that he'd be able to continue work on the world breaker here, but with Thorald's help. "I need a forge," he said, "and whatever rare metals you might have hidden away. We don't have much time, but if we can complete even a portion of the weapon, it might give us an edge against Alistair." Thorald nodded grimly. "My forge still stands, and I've got a few secrets tucked away that might surprise you. Come on." As they made their way through the battle-scarred streets, rallying villagers to their cause, Einar felt a surge of hope. Perhaps it wasn't too late. Perhaps he could save his home and fulfill his destiny. That hope was short-lived. A piercing shriek split the air, and a dark shadow passed overhead. Einar looked up to see a figure floating above the village, wreathed in crackling energy that hurt the eyes to look upon directly. Alistair had arrived. "People of Ravenswood," the mage's voice boomed, unnaturally loud. "Your defiance ends now. Surrender the smith called Einar and the components he carries, or watch your miserable village burn to ashes." Einar's fists clenched at his sides. He stepped forward, ready to offer himself in exchange for the village's safety, but Thorald's meaty hand clamped down on his shoulder. "Don't even think about it, boy," the old smith growled. "We didn't raise you to give up without a fight." Around them, villagers were gathering, their faces set in grim determination. An old woman Einar recognized as the baker's wife brandished a rolling pin like a club. The blacksmith's apprentice who had taken Einar's place hefted a hammer in each hand, his young face fierce beneath the soot. "We stand with Einar," someone shouted, and the cry was taken up by others. Alistair's response was swift and terrible. With a gesture, he sent bolts of dark energy raining down upon the village. Buildings exploded. The earth itself seemed to buckle and heave. "To the forge!" Thorald bellowed over the chaos. "We'll make our stand there." They ran, dodging magical blasts and falling debris. The old smith's forge stood like a fortress amidst the destruction, its thick stone walls scorched but unbroken. As they barricaded themselves inside, Einar's mind whirled with possibilities. "Master," he said, pulling the Worldbreaker components from his pack, "I need your help. We don't have time to finish it completely, but if we can join these pieces, create something that can channel the power of the celestial steel." Thorald's eyes widened as he examined the intricate metalwork. "By all the gods, boy, this is... I've never seen its like." He nodded firmly. "Tell me what to do." For the next hour, as magical assault raged outside and the sounds of battle echoed through the village, master and apprentice worked in perfect harmony. Einar's intuitive grasp of the celestial steel's properties combined with Thorald's decades of experience producing results that would have taken weeks under normal circumstances. Finally, they had something, not the completed Worldbreaker, but a crude approximation of its power. A sword that hummed with barely contained energy, its blade rippling like heat waves over desert sand. "It's not perfect," Einar said, hefting the weapon, "but it might be enough to—" His words were cut off as the forge's roof exploded inward. Alistair descended through the opening, his eyes blazing with dark fire, tendrils of shadow writhing around him like living things. "Foolish boy," the mage snarled. "Did you really think you could hide from me? That you could complete the Worldbreaker without my guidance?" His gaze fell upon the sword in Einar's hand and his lips curled in a sneer. "A pale imitation. Give it to me and I may yet show mercy to this miserable village." Einar raised the sword, its power thrumming through his arms. "Never. Whatever you and your dark allies are planning, it ends here." Alistair laughed, a cold, mirthless sound. "Oh, my poor, naive apprentice, it's already too late. The barriers between worlds grow thin. Soon the old ones will walk this realm once more, and reality itself will be unmade and reforged in their image." With a gesture, the mage sent a wave of crackling darkness surging towards Einar. Acting on instinct, Einar brought the sword up in a defensive stance. The two forces met in a blinding flash of energy that sent both combatants staggering. Einar recovered first, pressing his advantage. He moved with all the skill the monks had instilled in him, the sword in his hand feeling like an extension of his very being. For a moment it seemed as though he might actually prevail, but Alistair was not so easily defeated. With a snarl of fury, he redoubled his assault, dark magic lashing out like venomous serpents. Einar parried and dodged, but he could feel the sword growing hotter in his hands, the imperfect fusion of its components straining under the magical onslaught. "Einar!" Thorald's voice cut through the din of battle. "The sword can't take much more, you have to—" The old smith's warning came too late. With a sound like reality itself tearing, the sword shattered in Einar's grasp. The released energy sent him flying backwards, crashing through the forge's wall and out into the street beyond. Dazed and battered, Einar struggled to his feet. Through blurred vision, he saw Alistair emerge from the ruined forge, the broken components of the Worldbreaker floating before him in a nimbus of dark energy. A valiant effort, the mage said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. But ultimately futile. The Worldbreaker will be completed, Einar. It is inevitable. The only question is whether you'll live to see the new world it ushers in. As unconsciousness threatened to overtake him, Einar's hand closed around a familiar shape, a hammer, knocked from its place on Thorold's wall. In that moment, he made a decision. "You're right about one thing, Alistair," he managed, forcing himself to stand. "The Worldbreaker will be completed, but not by you. Never by you." With the last of his strength, Einar hurled the hammer at the floating components. There was a flash of light, a sound like 1,000 forges igniting at once, and then darkness. When Einar awoke, he found himself in a bed, bandaged and aching but very much alive. Thorold sat nearby, his craggy face etched with concern and exhaustion. "Welcome back to the land of the living, lad," the old smith said gruffly. "The village?" Einar croaked. "Alistair?" Thorold's expression darkened. "The village stands, thanks in no small part to you. As for that bastard mage, he's gone. Disappeared in that last explosion. But I don't think we've seen the last of him." Einar nodded slowly, wincing at the movement. "And the Worldbreaker components?" "Scattered," Thorold replied. "To the four winds, near as we can tell. Whatever you did, it sent them far and wide." Einar closed his eyes, a mix of relief and dread washing over him. The components were beyond Alistair's reach for now. But they were also beyond his, which meant, "We have to start over," he said, opening his eyes with new determination. "From scratch. But this time, we'll do it right. No shortcuts, no compromises." Thorold smiled, a fierce pride shining in his eyes. "That's my boy. Rest now. When you're healed, we've got a world to save and a weapon to forge." As he drifted back to sleep, Einar's mind was already racing with plans and possibilities. The road ahead would be long and fraught with danger, but he was ready. He was a smith, a warrior, and the reluctant guardian of a power that could shape the fate of worlds. The true forging was about to begin. The forge's heat pressed against Einar's skin as he worked, the rhythmic clang of hammer on metal a comfort in these uncertain times. Weeks had passed since the battle for Ravenswood, and the village had slowly begun to rebuild. But Einar knew the peace was fragile, a mere lull before the coming storm. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow, and glanced at the battered scroll that lay unfurled on a nearby workbench. The parchment that had started him on this journey now seemed a pitiful thing, its edges charred and its text faded. Yet it still held secrets. He was certain of it. As if in answer to his thoughts, a flicker of movement caught his eye. Einar frowned, leaning closer to the scroll. There, in the spaces between the lines he knew by heart, faint letters were appearing, shimmering like heat haze over summer fields. "By all the gods," he breathed, snatching up the scroll. "Master Thorold, come quickly." The old smith hurried over, his bushy eyebrows drawn together in concern. "What is it, lad? Has something gone wrong with the forging?" Einar shook his head, holding out the scroll. "Look, there's more here, hidden text revealing itself." Thorold squinted at the parchment, his eyes widening as he saw the ghostly letters taking shape. "Well, I'll be damned, what does it say?" Together they bent over the scroll, deciphering the newly revealed text. As they read, Einar felt the blood drain from his face, his hands beginning to shake. "This can't be right," he muttered. "It doesn't make sense." Thorold's expression was grim. "I'm afraid it makes all too much sense, boy. We've been fools, the lot of us." The hidden text spoke of the Worldbreaker's true purpose, not a weapon to save the world, but a key to unlock the barriers between realms. It spoke of ancient beings, slumbering in the spaces between worlds waiting to be awakened. And it spoke of a bargain, struck eons ago, between those beings and certain power-hungry humans who sought to reshape reality itself. Alistair? Einar spat the name like a curse. He knew. He's not trying to destroy the world, he's trying to remake it, Thorold finished, in the image of these sleeping horrors. The old smith's face was ashen. And we've been helping him, all unknowing. Einar slumped against the workbench, his mind reeling. Everything he'd believed about his destiny, about the weapon he was forging, had been turned on its head. He looked at the half-finished components scattered around the forge, each one a potential key to unleashing unimaginable evil upon the world. "What do we do now?" he asked, hating how lost he sounded. Thorold was silent for a long moment, stroking his beard thoughtfully. "We need counsel," he said at last. "This is too big for us to decide alone. Come, lad, we'll call a meeting of the village elders." As the sun set, casting long shadows across Ravenswood, Einar found himself standing before a semicircle of grim-faced elders. He'd just finished relating the scroll's hidden message, and a heavy silence hung in the air. "Are you certain of this, young Einar?" asked Helga, the village healer, her eyes sharp despite her advanced years. "Could this not be some trick of the mages?" Einar shook his head. "I wish it were, Mistress Helga. But deep down, I think I've known the truth for some time. The way the metal resists shaping, the strange energies it gives off, we're dealing with forces far beyond our understanding." "Then perhaps we should stop trying to understand them," growled Bjorn, a grizzled veteran of many battles. "Destroy the components, burn the scroll, and be done with it." "It's not that simple," Thorold interjected. "The knowledge is out there now. Alistair and his dark allies won't stop searching for a way to complete the world breaker, and there's no guarantee that destroying what we have would be enough to thwart their plans." The debate raged on, voices rising and falling as each elder offered their opinion. Einar listened, his heart heavy with the weight of the choice before him. Continue forging a weapon that could doom the world, or abandon his quest and leave humanity defenseless against the coming darkness? As the argument reached a fever pitch, a new voice cut through the clamor. Quiet, but filled with authority. "Tell me, young smith," said old Mother Inga, her milky eyes seeming to peer straight into Einar's soul. "What does your heart tell you?" Einar swallowed hard, feeling the eyes of everyone in the room upon him. "My heart tells me that I cannot, in good conscience, forge a weapon meant to unmake the world," he said slowly. "But it also tells me that I cannot stand idly by while Alistair and his allies threaten everything we hold dear." A crooked smile played across old Mother Inga's wrinkled face. "Wisdom often lies in the space between extremes, child. Perhaps the answer is not to forge the world breaker as it was meant to be, but to create something new, a shield, rather than a sword." Einar's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "A ward," he breathed. "Something to strengthen the barriers between worlds rather than break them down." Excited murmurs rippled through the gathered elders. But before they could discuss further, the door burst open, admitting a breathless village scout. "Elders! Einar!" the young man gasped. "Riders approaching from the east. But they're like nothing I've ever seen before." Einar's blood ran cold. He rushed to the window, peering out into the gathering darkness. What he saw made his heart clench in his chest. A host of dark riders approached, their mounts twisted parodies of horses, all scales and teeth and too many legs. At their head rode a figure Einar recognized all too well. Alistair, his form warped by dark magics, tendrils of shadow writhing around him like a cloak. But it was the things that loped alongside the riders that truly chilled Einar's blood. Misshapen creatures that seemed to flicker in and out of existence, leaving trails of unreality in their wake. He knew with dreadful certainty that these were beings summoned from beyond the veil, a taste of what awaited if Alistair's plans came to fruition. "They're here," Einar said, his voice tight. "And they've brought allies from the spaces between worlds." The elders erupted in panic, but Thorald's voice cut through the chaos. "What's the plan, lad?" he asked, his faith in his former apprentice unwavering. Einar took a deep breath, his mind racing. They couldn't hope to defeat such a force in open battle. But perhaps... "We need to strike at the heart," he said, his voice growing stronger as the plan took shape. "Alistair is the key. If we can reach him, stop him from completing the ritual to fully open the barriers." "You mean to infiltrate his stronghold?" Bjorn asked, incredulous. "It would be suicide." "Not if we give them what they think they want," Einar countered. He turned to Thorald. "Master, how quickly can we forge a decoy? Something that looks like the Worldbreaker, but is nothing more than ordinary steel?" Understanding dawned in the old smith's eyes. "Quickly enough, if we work through the night. But Einar, what you're suggesting is dangerous, yes," Einar finished. "But it might be our only chance. While they're focused on the decoy, I can slip in and find a way to end this once and for all." The elders debated furiously, but in the end, they saw the wisdom in Einar's plan. As the village prepared for the coming assault, Einar and Thorald returned to the forge, determination etched on their faces. Through the long night they worked, hammer and tongs shaping ordinary steel into a facsimile of the dreaded Worldbreaker. As dawn broke, Einar held up their creation, a sword that gleamed with false promise. "It's done," he said, his voice hoarse from the smoke and exertion. "Now comes the hard part." Thorald clasped his shoulder, pride and worry warring in his eyes. "Be careful, lad. You've grown into a fine smith and a finer man. I couldn't be prouder if you were my own flesh and blood." Einar nodded, emotion threatening to choke him. "Thank you, master, for everything." As he prepared to leave, strapping on armor and secreting away the true components of the Worldbreaker, Einar's mind turned to the choice that still lay before him. Old Mother Inga's words echoed in his thoughts. A shield, not a sword. In that moment, as the sounds of battle began to reach his ears, Einar made his decision. The Worldbreaker would be completed, but not as its creators had intended. He would reshape it, reforge it into something that could protect the world rather than destroy it. With a deep breath, Einar stepped out of the forge and into the chaos of the coming battle. The fate of the world hung in the balance, and he carried the weight of that destiny with every step. The night was thick with the stench of brimstone and the cacophony of battle, as Einar led his small band through the shadows towards the mage's fortress. The decoy Worldbreaker hung at his hip, a constant reminder of the desperate gamble they were undertaking. Beside him crept Astrid, the village's best scout, her eyes sharp in the gloom. Behind them came Gunnar, a burly former soldier whose axe had already tasted blood this night, and Lifa, a hedge witch whose quiet chants kept them hidden from prying magical eyes. As they neared the fortress walls, Einar held up a hand, signaling a halt. Before them loomed a structure that seemed to defy the laws of nature. Stone twisted into impossible shapes, shadows that moved of their own accord, and an oppressive aura that made the very air feel thick and cloying. "By the gods," Gunnar muttered, his knuckles white on his axe haft. "What manner of devilry is this?" Einar's jaw clenched. The worst kind. Alistair's tampering with forces beyond mortal ken. "We have to end this, here and now." Astrid pointed to a narrow fissure in the wall, barely visible in the flickering torchlight. "There. It's not much, but it might be our way in." With a nod, Einar led them toward the opening. As they squeezed through, the wrongness of the place pressed in on them like a physical weight. Lifa's chants took on a strained quality, her brow beaded with sweat from the effort of maintaining their mystical concealment. They emerged into a courtyard that defied description. Staircases that led nowhere, fountains that flowed upwards, and everywhere the writhing shadows that seemed to reach for them with grasping tendrils. "Stay close," Einar whispered, "and whatever you do, don't touch the shadows." They had taken no more than a dozen steps when a harsh laugh echoed around them. From the darkness emerged a figure that might once have been human, but was now a twisted parody of life. Scales covered half its face and its eyes glowed with an unholy light. "Well, well," it rasped. "What have we here? Rats in the master's maze?" Gunnar hefted his axe with a snarl. "Who are you calling rat, you scaly bastard?" The creature's mouth split in a too-wide grin. "Oh, I'm going to enjoy this." It raised a clawed hand, dark energy crackling between its fingers. Einar didn't hesitate. He drew the decoy worldbreaker, its ordinary steel gleaming in the eldritch light. "Now!" he shouted. As one, they sprang into action. Gunnar charged forward, his axe describing a deadly arc. Astrid's bow sang, sending arrows whistling through the air with unerring accuracy. Lifa's chants rose to a fever pitch, weaving protective magics around them. And Einar moved like the wind itself, the months of training with the monks flowing through him. The decoy sword might not have been the true world breaker, but in his hands it was deadly all the same. The corrupted guardian fell, but more emerged from the shadows. Soon, the courtyard was a maelstrom of clashing steel and flashing magic. Einar lost himself in the rhythm of battle, trusting his companions to watch his back as he carved a path deeper into the fortress. They fought through corridors that seemed to shift and change around them, battled monstrosities that should not exist in any sane world. With each step, Einar could feel the true components of the world breaker thrumming in his pack, resonating with the dark energies that saturated this place. Finally, battered and bloodied but unbroken, they reached the heart of the fortress. Before them stood a massive door, etched with runes that hurt the eyes to look upon. "This is it," Einar said, his voice hoarse from exertion. "Whatever Alistair's planning, it's happening behind that door." Lifa stepped forward, her face pale but determined. I can feel the power radiating from within. Einar, if we open this, there may be no coming back." Einar nodded grimly. "I know, but we've come too far to turn back now." He turned to his companions, seeing the fear and resolve mirrored in their eyes. "Whatever happens, it's been an honor." With a great heave, they pushed the door open. Beyond lay a chamber that seemed to exist outside of normal space. A vast, swirling vortex of energy with a stone dais at its center. And there, arms raised in triumph, stood Alistair. The mage turned, his eyes widening in surprise and then narrowing with cruel amusement. "Einar, my wayward apprentice, how kind of you to deliver the Worldbreaker right to me." Einar stepped forward, the decoy sword held before him. "It ends here, Alistair. Whatever you're planning, whatever bargain you've made with those things beyond the veil, it stops now." Alistair threw back his head and laughed, the sound echoing unnaturally in the swirling chamber. "Oh, you fool. You understand nothing. The prophecy, the Worldbreaker, it was all leading to this moment, the remaking of reality itself." "You're mad," Einar spat. "You'll doom us all." The mage's eyes gleamed with fanatical light. "Doom? No, boy. I'll save us. This imperfect world with all its suffering and chaos, it will be wiped clean. And from the ashes we'll forge a new reality. Perfect, orderly, eternal." As Alistair spoke, the vortex behind him pulsed and writhed. Einar could see things moving within it. Vast, unknowable shapes that hurt the mind to comprehend. "Enough talk," Einar growled. He raised the decoy sword. "Face me, Alistair. End this like a man, not hiding behind your dark magics." A sneer twisted the mage's features. "As you wish." With a gesture, he summoned a blade of pure shadow, its edge flickering with malevolent energy. What followed was a duel unlike any Einar had experienced. Alistair moved with inhuman speed, his shadow blade leaving trails of unreality in its wake. Einar countered with every ounce of skill the monks had instilled in him, the decoy Worldbreaker flashing in complex patterns. Around them, the chamber shuddered and heaved. The vortex expanded, tendrils of otherworldly energy lashing out. Einar could hear his companions battling more of the corrupted guardians that poured in through the door, but he couldn't spare them a glance. All his focus was on Alistair. As they fought, Einar felt the true components of the World-Breaker growing hot in his pack. An idea formed. Desperate, perhaps suicidal, but their only hope. "You want the World-Breaker so badly?" Einar shouted over the din of battle. "Then take it." He hurled the decoy sword at Alistair. The mage, caught off guard, instinctively reached out to catch it. In that moment of distraction, Einar pulled the true components from his pack and brought them together. There was a sound like reality tearing, a flash of light that seared the eyes. When Einar's vision cleared, he held in his hands not a sword, but a shield, one that hummed with power beyond mortal understanding. Alistair's eyes widened in shock and fury. "What have you done?" he howled. Einar planted his feet, raising the shield before him. "What I should have done from the beginning. The World-Breaker was never meant to destroy Alistair. It was meant to protect." With a roar of rage, the mage hurled himself at Einar, his shadow blade crashing against the newly forged shield. Energy exploded outward, sending both combatants staggering. The vortex pulsed, the shapes within it pressing against the thinning barriers between worlds. Alistair's face contorted with manic glee. "You're too late," he crowed. "The old ones come. Reality itself bows before their might." But Einar stood firm, the shield blazing with inner light. "No," he said, his voice ringing with certainty. "This is where it ends." He thrust the shield forward, focusing all his will, all his hope, into its gleaming surface. A wave of pure energy erupted from it, slamming into the vortex. The swirling energies recoiled, the vast shapes retreating with soundless screams that echoed in the mind rather than the ears. Alistair howled in denial, hurling bolt after bolt of dark magic at Einar. But the shield absorbed each attack, growing brighter with each impact. The very fabric of the fortress began to unravel around them, stone crumbling and reality itself seeming to fray at the edges. "It's over, Alistair," Einar said, advancing step by inexorable step. "Let it go. Come back to the light." For a moment, something like sanity flickered in the mage's eyes, but then his face twisted into a rictus of hate. "Never," he snarled, and with a final, desperate gesture, he tore open a rift in space itself. Einar lunged forward, the shield before him. There was a blinding flash, a sensation of falling, and then silence. When Einar opened his eyes, he found himself lying amid the rubble of what had once been Alistair's fortress. The shield, the true World-Breaker, lay beside him, its surface now dark and quiescent. Groaning, he pushed himself to his feet. Around him, he saw his companions stirring, battered but alive. Of Alistair, there was no sign. As the dust settled and the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Einar gazed at the shield that had saved them all. He knew that this was not the end. There would be other threats, other battles to fight. But for now, for this moment, they had won. The world was safe. And Einar, once a simple smith's apprentice, now stood as its reluctant guardian, the World-Breaker remade into a force of protection rather than destruction. As his companions gathered around him, their faces etched with wonder and relief, Einar allowed himself a small smile. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew he would not face them alone. The world around Einar and the mage dissolved into a swirling vortex of light and shadow. The crumbling fortress, the sounds of battle, and the acrid smell of smoke all faded away. In their place, an ethereal plane materialized, a realm that existed between worlds, where the very fabric of reality seemed malleable. Einar's feet touched down on what appeared to be solid ground, though it shimmered and rippled like the surface of a calm lake. The mage stood before him, his once handsome features now twisted by dark magic and darker ambitions. "Where have you brought us?" Einar demanded, gripping the unfinished weapon tightly. The mage's laughter echoed across the boundless expanse. "I've brought us nowhere, young smith. Your weapon, the very thing you've poured your heart and soul into, has torn a hole in the veil between worlds." Einar's eyes widened as he took in their surroundings. Floating islands of rock and crystal hung suspended in the air, each one seeming to contain glimpses of different realms, some familiar, others utterly alien. "What you see before you," the mage continued, sweeping his arm in a grand gesture, "are the threads that bind all of existence together, and with the power of your weapon I shall unravel them and reshape reality as I see fit." Einar's mind raced, recalling the hidden text he had discovered on the ancient scroll. "No," he said, his voice growing stronger. "That's not the weapon's true purpose. It was never meant to destroy or conquer." The mage's eyes narrowed. "You understand nothing, boy. The prophecy speaks of unimaginable power, power that rightfully belongs to one who can wield it." "You're wrong," Einar countered, taking a step forward. "The prophecy speaks of balance, of mending the rifts between worlds, not tearing them apart." As if in response to his words, the incomplete weapon in Einar's hands began to glow with an inner light. He could feel it resonating with the energies of this strange plane, growing warmer and more alive with each passing moment. The mage's face contorted with rage. "Enough. If you won't use the weapon as it was meant to be used, then I'll take it from your lifeless hands." He raised his staff, dark energy crackling around it. Einar braced himself for the attack, but it never came. Instead, he felt a gentle touch on his shoulder. Turning, he gasped as he saw a shimmering figure standing beside him, a woman with kind eyes and a familiar smile. "Mother?" Einar whispered, his voice choked with emotion. The apparition nodded. "My son, you have carried the weight of destiny on your shoulders for so long. But you are not alone in this fight." More figures appeared. Some Einar recognized, others he did not. Warriors, smiths, and mages from across time and space, all drawn to this nexus point by the power of the weapon and the magnitude of the moment. "No," the mage roared, "I won't be denied my destiny." He unleashed a torrent of dark magic, the attack rippling across the ethereal plane. Einar raised the weapon instinctively, and to his amazement, it absorbed the mage's attack. He could feel the conflicting energies warring within the metal, threatening to tear it apart. "The weapon," his mother's spirit said urgently. "It's incomplete. It needs a final component to fulfill its true purpose." Einar met her gaze, understanding dawning in his eyes. "A sacrifice," he said softly. She nodded, tears shimmering in her ethereal eyes. "Your essence, your experiences, your very being, they are the missing piece. But know that this choice comes at a great cost." Einar looked around at the assembled spirits, then back at the raging mage who was preparing another attack. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of countless worlds resting on his decision. "I understand," Einar said, his voice steady. "I'm ready." With those words, Einar plunged his hands into the core of the weapon. Pain, unlike anything he had ever experienced, coursed through his body, but he gritted his teeth and pressed on. He could feel his memories, his hopes, his very soul merging with the metal. The mage, realizing what was happening, let out a howl of fury. "No, I won't let you ruin everything." He charged forward, dark magic swirling around him like a tornado. But it was too late. With a final surge of will, Einar completed the merger. The weapon flared with blinding light, and Einar felt his consciousness expanding, touching every corner of the ethereal plane and beyond. In that moment, he understood everything. He saw the delicate balance that held the multiverse together, the wounds that had been torn in the fabric of reality, and the role he and the weapon were meant to play in healing those wounds. Einar turned to face the charging mage, his eyes now shimmering with the same inner light as the weapon. When he spoke, his voice resonated with power beyond imagining. "It's over," Einar said simply. The mage stopped in his tracks, his face a mask of disbelief and fear. What are you?" Einar smiled sadly. "I am what I was always meant to be. The keystone, the bridge, the healer of worlds." With that, Einar raised the completed weapon, Energy surged forth, not in a destructive blast, but in waves of healing light that washed over the ethereal plane. The floating islands began to shift, realigning themselves like pieces of a cosmic puzzle. The mage screamed as the light engulfed him, his form dissolving into motes of energy that were reabsorbed into the fabric of reality. Einar felt no joy in the mage's defeat, only a profound sense of completion. As the light faded, Einar found himself alone in the ethereal plane. The spirits had vanished, their purpose fulfilled. He could feel the weapon. No, it was a part of him now, pulsing with the heartbeat of countless worlds. Einar closed his eyes, sensing the task that lay before him. There were wounds to mend, balances to restore, and a new legend to forge. As his consciousness spread across the multiverse, a small part of him, the part that was still the young smith from a small village, whispered a quiet goodbye to the life he had known. In that moment, on countless worlds, in countless tongues, a new story began to spread. It spoke of a humble smith who had taken up the mantle of destiny, sacrificing everything to forge a new future. Some called him the World Smith, others the Cosmic Forge, but all knew that reality itself had been forever changed by his choice. And in the spaces between worlds, Einar, or what Einar had become, continued his eternal work, mending the fabric of existence one thread at a time, his legend growing with each passing age. As eons passed, some would swear they caught glimpses of a figure in the night sky, hammer in hand, tending to the forge of destiny. And though the details of his story might change with each telling, the truth at its heart remained constant, that even the humblest among us can rise to shape the fate of all.